On the morning of Thursday, July 20th, 1978, 25-year-old Magnolia, Arkansas resident Mary Bobo Shinn had big plans. After teaching a children's art class at her studio north of the city, she planned to get together with friends, play tennis, and lounge out by the pool. However, when an unknown man called about taking a look at a house that she had listed for sale, Bobo put her plans on hold. The caller, who she never identified by name, explained that his car was in the shop and he'd need to take a taxi to meet the young woman. But when Bobo heard this, she told the man not to worry and that she'd come pick him up from a local convenience store. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, she was spotted in several places in and around the city behind the wheel of her custom blue 1976 Buick Special. Hours later, friends and family grew concerned when they hadn't heard or seen the 25-year-old. After her mother went out searching, Bobo's car was located abandoned in the parking lot of a grocery store. The windows were down, the doors unlocked, the keys dangled from the ignition, and the young woman's purse had been dumped out all over the passenger seat. A pair of white shoes were found on the floorboard of the driver's side, slightly tucked up beneath the brake and accelerator. The car was scratched up, covered in dust, pine needles, and grass seeds. There was no sign of Bobo anywhere. For more than 40 years, the disappearance has haunted not just her family, but also local law enforcement and the entire city of Magnolia. While some believe the artist and budding house flipper may have been selected at random by a total stranger from an ad she'd placed in the paper, others believe she was likely targeted by a local, someone who knew Bobo, knew the lay of the land, and knew exactly what to do. Was it a case of a kidnapping gone wrong, a targeted and well-planned out abduction, or was it really a random case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? This is Trace Evidence, episode 246, The Disappearance of Mary Jimmie Bobo Shinn. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today, we begin our 8th year of Trace Evidence with one of the more mystifying disappearances I've ever covered. Before jumping into the case, though, I wanted to mention that I'll have an announcement or two at the end of the episode, so make sure you stick around to find out about some new, exciting endeavors for Trace Evidence. With that being said, let's not waste any more time. This is episode 246, The Disappearance of Mary Jimmie Bobo Shinn. It was an uncomfortably hot and muggy afternoon in southwestern Arkansas. A slight breeze sweeping in from the east offered little more than a tease of relief that was quickly swallowed back by the oppressive summer afternoon. A thin veil of gray clouds hung over the landscape, like a dusty old blanket whose frayed and torn expanse showed glimmering hints of the vast blue sky beyond. While the cloud cover provided a slight respite from the scorching sunlight, it did little to suppress the grossly sticky atmosphere that shone through in the dark mat of sweat-soaked shirts and flushed faces as locals fruitlessly drew old kerchiefs from warm pockets in an attempt to brush back the dewy sweat beating upon their brows. While some sought out what little comforts could be provided by local pools and the spitting hiss of lawn sprinklers spinning amidst the green grass, those driving more contemporary vehicles rolled up their windows and clicked on the air conditioning for a moment's peace. However, for many, there was no escaping the unrelenting heat as they proceeded on to their jobs or made their way across town running necessary errands. This was true of 63-year-old Harry Irwin, a local man who, when he wasn't operating in his official capacity as the tax collector for Columbia County, was busy maintaining and working the large fields of his farm, then located just outside the city limits of Magnolia, the seat of Columbia County. Using the back of his hand to sweep away stray hair stuck to his forehead as sweat poured down his face, the man took a momentary break from the arduous task of baling hay to catch his breath and look out over the expanse of his property. The roadway leading west out of town bent and arched its way, twisting right along the border of Harry's property, and while traffic was thin, to say the least, he often saw people as they headed toward or exited from Magnolia. Some cars he recognized, others he couldn't confirm having seen before, but either way there was hardly a cavalcade to keep up with. On this particular Thursday afternoon, though, there would be one car that would not only stand out, but the memory of it would haunt Irwin for the rest of his life. It was just after noon when he spotted the blue car moving along the gravel road, kicking up a cloud of dirt and dust in its wake. Irwin watched as the vehicle's speed slowed and then began veering side to side along the roadway. Squinting his eyes, Irwin couldn't make out distinct features, but saw enough to later confirm that there was a woman at the wheel and a man in the passenger seat. They appeared to be arguing and struggling for control of the wheel, which then seemed to be causing the car's wild swerving. Irwin watched as the vehicle appeared to right itself, and the metallic blue gleam vanished into the distance, followed quickly by the dust storm clinging to its rear bumper. At the time, Irwin thought little of the event he had just witnessed. Not long after, he would fully grasp the gravity of what he had seen when he came to learn that Bobo Shinn, daughter of a prominent local businessman and member of a well-known Magnolia family, vanished that very afternoon. Her car, with its custom blue paint job, was found hours later, abandoned in a grocery store parking lot. Evidence at the scene suggested the vehicle had been driven through a dusty area and perhaps even a hayfield. What had become of the missing 25-year-old remains a mystery to this day. While more than 40 years have passed, many in Magnolia remember the disappearance and cite it as the day Magnolia lost its sense of safety and security that it had exuded for prior generations. Harry Irwin would always wonder what became of Miss Shinn and whether or not he truly was the last person to see her alive. Mary Jimmie Shinn was born on Sunday, January 11, 1953 in Columbia County, Arkansas, to parents Gresham and Sue. Mary would go on to be the couple's fourth out of 5 children and notably the last daughter, the baby girl of the family. She grew up with 3 older sisters, Sarah, Linda, and Becky, and later would be an older sister herself to the final member of the family, a boy named Jay. At a young age, Mary was given the nickname Bobo, which permeates the entire record of her life. From official documents to school yearbooks, everyone referred to her as Bobo, and for the sake of keeping things simple, I will do the same from here on out. There are a large number of descriptions of Bobo throughout her youth, but they all tend to agree on several key descriptors. She was a happy, fun-loving young woman who was very close with her family. She loved traveling and was an outdoor enthusiast who enjoyed swimming and playing tennis, which would become a daily activity for her as she grew older. However, it would be art that captured Bobo's heart and mind most powerfully, and she was quite gifted. From an early age, it was apparent to everyone that, while she could achieve anything she set her mind to, art was forever entwined with her mind and soul. Her ardent love of art would be fed in part through family, as her mother had her own interests in the arts and encouraged creative expression in her children. Bobo grew up in a nice, comfortable home in an affluent neighborhood along Sioux Street, just over a mile north of the city center. Her father, Gresham, was well known throughout the city. He was a self-made man who had overcome many hardships, ultimately becoming a prominent motel contractor who was involved in many of the city's hotel and motel enterprises. While Sue may have passed on a love of the arts to her children, Gresham instilled in them an appreciation for property speculation and development. Sue was also involved in the business side, with it being noted that she had become involved in the hospitality industry, along with Gresham, beginning in 1949. Together, the couple formed the family business, Magnolia Lodging, and their development of hotels and motels spread beyond Arkansas, with them operating Hilton and Marriott properties in Dallas, Texas as well. The couple would go on to develop more than 50 properties in their lives together. Bobo would take on all sides, possessing both an innate artistic ability and a keen eye for real estate, the latter of which would play an eminent role in the mystery surrounding her later disappearance. As a youngster, she attended Eastside Elementary School. She was active in school and extracurricular activities, joining the Girl Scouts and later the school band. She also became very involved in the church, specifically Magnolia Central Baptist Church, which the family regularly attended and where her mother Sue taught Sunday school for many years. According to everyone who knew her, Bobo was a very welcoming and kind young woman who made friends easily and developed a large circle of friends and acquaintances. Academically, she was as dedicated and gifted as she was to art, earning high marks and a constant spot on the honor roll. As a teen, she went on to attend Magnolia High School, where she continued to be involved in all manner of activities. Her senior yearbook notes her as belonging to the student council, history club, French club, pep club, as well as being voted into homecoming royalty. Starting in her sophomore year, she became a cheerleader and would later go on to take her place as captain. In the spring of 1971, she graduated from Magnolia High with honors and went on to attend Southern Arkansas University, located less than a mile from the family home. Continuing with her high academic standards, Bobo pursued a degree in art, and in the spring of 1976, she graduated, obtaining a bachelor's degree in studio art. Bobo was a highly talented artist, and many of her works were exhibited at her alma mater, as well as at the Arkansas Center for Arts in the state capital of Little Rock. Her involvement and skill are still honored, with artist exhibitions and rewards to gifted artists being granted in her name. Not long after earning her degree, Bobo opened an art studio in a small home then located at 423 Magnolia Street, just over a mile south of the family home. There, she would paint, display her own work, and teach. At the time, she taught painting, drawing, and art history to both adults and children. Her appreciation for art expanded beyond her own interests, and she took great pride in helping others to find their footing in the world of artistic expression. In addition to her artistic endeavors, Bobo followed in her father's footsteps and turned an eye towards real estate development, but not quite on the same level. Her interests didn't involve building hotels and motels, but rather focusing in on homes in Magnolia that had fallen into disrepair. She'd buy a home, put in the money and work necessary to bring it back to life, and then she would sell that revitalized property at a profit, what today we refer to as house flipping. As a result, many local papers and media reports would later refer to Bobo as a real estate agent, but that wasn't exactly accurate. She didn't own a business, nor was she hired on to sell homes. You wouldn't see her face in the local papers with a house listing, nor did her image appear on for sale signs or bus stop benches. It was a hobby, for lack of a better term, and something her father had encouraged her involvement in as a way to earn money to bankroll her art studio, which was far from a lucrative endeavor, but rather a passion project. Even then, it wasn't the most valuable pursuit, as Bobo didn't want to deal with large homes and high values, rather spending her time working on smaller homes and selling them for an exceedingly thin profit margin. By the summer of 1978, things were going well for Bobo, who was then 25 years old. She lived a busy life between outings with friends, time spent with her family, and balancing her art studio against her real estate prospects. She continued to live in the family home on Sioux Street, and if she wasn't at home or work, there was a good chance of finding her on a tennis court or soaking up the sun poolside at one of her father's hotels. At the time, she frequented the pool of the Coachman's Inn, a property her father had developed, located along East Main Street, just a few blocks south from her studio. One afternoon, while making her way to her small studio, she came upon an older home in need of restoration. Located at 718 East McNeil Street, the home was less than half a mile from her studio, 2 blocks to the north. It was a small 2-bedroom single-family home just over 800 square feet, which had originally been constructed in 1949. Bobo knew a good project when she saw one, and over a period of weeks she put in the elbow grease where she could and hired workers to complete tasks she wasn't quite up to. When work on the house was done, she took out an ad in the Magnolia Banner News. There were no photos, just a straightforward write-up which read, "Beginner's Delight, 2-bedroom, completely remodeled, good location." The ad listed the McNeil Street address and a number to call for interested parties. That number would ring the Shinn family home. The ad first appeared in the paper on Friday, July 14th, 6 days before the disappearance. On Saturday, July 15th, just the next day, an unidentified man caught the attention of a clerk at what was then the Townhouse Motel. Located at 301 East Main Street, the townhouse was a Shinn family property located across the street and just west of the Coachman's Inn. Door to door, the two buildings are 331 feet apart, and both motels are within clear view of one another. According to an employee at the townhouse, a white male with a beard stepped out from a white car and entered the lobby. Another person was seen waiting inside of the white car, while the bearded man picked up a wall-mounted payphone and appeared to make a few different calls, though details are sparse. The employee would later tell authorities that this unknown bearded man then approached the front desk and specifically asked the female clerk if she knew where Bobo Shinn hung out. When the clerk replied that she didn't know for sure, the man turned and exited the lobby, apparently getting back into the white car and driving off. At the time, the employee found it strange, but nothing to be overly concerned about. I should note, no specific time has ever been reported for when this encounter happened. On this same day, though, Sue Shinn reported that she had answered a call from an unknown man who wanted to know where her daughter was. Sue explained to the Shreveport Journal, saying, quote, "He said he had talked to Bobo about trading a house that he had, 7 or 9 miles out on the Taylor Highway for one of her houses. He asked me where Bobo hung out. I told him Bobo didn't hang out anywhere, that she was usually either here or at the studio." End quote. The call was brief, but odd enough for Sue to mention it to her daughter when she arrived home later that day. According to Sue, Bobo didn't have much of a reaction and made no references to the caller or his identity, if she knew it. At the time, it was brushed aside, with Bobo noting that if the caller was serious about the house, he'd call back. Whether or not the unknown man ever rang the Shinn family home again is unknown. The next few days seemingly passed with little of note for Bobo. She spent her time as she often did, teaching, working on her art, hanging out with friends and family. Whether or not anyone else called about the home on East McNeil Street between Sunday and Wednesday has never been reported, and there are no confirmed sightings of the unknown bearded man during that time period either. On Wednesday, July 19th, the day before Bobo's disappearance, she received a call from a man who expressed interest in purchasing the home. Much like the sighting at the Townhouse Motel, there is no officially released time for when this call happened. However, it was confirmed that Bobo agreed to meet the potential buyer at the home so he could get the full tour, and that meeting occurred at approximately 4 p.m. Sue and Gresham later noted that Bobo didn't mention the viewing to either of them, which generally meant she didn't think it would go anywhere. Sue explained later, saying, quote, "She didn't mention his name, and any other time, she probably would have. She acted like she probably wouldn't see him again, like it was not a big prospect. If she thought it was important, she would have talked it over with her father." End quote. This seems to suggest, at least from Sue's perspective, that Bobo likely didn't believe there was going to be a sale made. For what reason she felt that way, we have no way of knowing, and given the circumstances, she shared no details with her family or any of her friends. No names were given, no terms discussed. It ultimately appears that for Bobo, the showing had fallen flat and she had no expectations moving forward. On the other hand, there had to have been some kind of an interaction between the two, which opened the door for continued discussion about the McNeil home, because as we will soon learn, the potential buyer was given the phone number to Bobo's Magnolia Street art studio and arranged a time to call the following day. Thursday, July 20th, 1978 began as a warm, clear morning with blue skies and temperatures in the upper 60s. Shortly after sunrise at 6:19 a.m., temperatures would begin a steady climb, reaching the 90s by early afternoon, and with that scorching heat came a sticky veil of humidity and graying clouds. According to Sue, that Thursday began as most days did, with she and Bobo rising early and setting out on their normal morning walk at approximately 6:30. She recalled her daughter being dressed in cut-off blue jeans and tennis shoes, though there was apparently nothing that stood out as unusual or worth remembering during their walk and morning chat. After arriving back at the family home, Sue told Bobo that she would be heading off with one of her sisters to visit a family member in Hope, a city located approximately 40 miles northwest of Magnolia. Bobo's plans for the day, at least in what she told her mother, were simple. She'd be driving over to her studio where she was set to teach a children's art class that morning. Sue would be haunted by that morning, not because of an eerie feeling or anything of concern that jumped out at her, but because of how completely normal and casual it was. She later noted, quote, "I went on and got ready to leave, and she was in her room getting ready to go. I just went by her room. She told me to have fun." End quote. She never imagined this would be the last time she'd ever see her daughter. The curse of hindsight often retroactively transforms even the most normal of moments into mysteries, where those desperate for answers become lost in the fog of unknowing, hunting for red flags or hidden clues with even the most conventional of encounters. Bobo's movements for the next few hours following that walk have never been reported if they're actually known. The 25-year-old next shows up in the record at 10 a.m., when she began teaching a children's art class at her Magnolia Street studio. Shortly after 11 a.m., Angie Pendrick, a good friend of Bobo's, called her at the studio to check in and confirm plans they had made to play tennis that afternoon. Angie detailed the conversation to the Magnolia Banner News, saying, quote, "She said, after answering the phone, that she thought I was the man who was supposed to be calling her. She said that if it was to be the man who was looking at her house. I asked her to come to my house. She said that she would if the man didn't want to see the house right away. I hung up quickly so that she could get her other call." End quote. Bobo reportedly stated that she was expecting the man to call around 11:15. Around the same time that Angie was on the phone with Bobo, an unidentified man entered the Easy Mart, a convenience store with a drive-through window, then located on the northeast corner of East Main Street and North Dudney Streets, just over half a mile south of the studio. The store was then located directly across Dudney Street from Smitty's grocery store and north across Main Street from a car dealership, Jordan Brothers Pontiac Buick, then at 621 East Main. The unidentified man approached the counter and presented cash, asking the employee to make change for him so he could make a phone call. At 11:15 a.m., a witness who works across the street from the Easy Mart reported seeing the unknown man standing in front of the building using the public payphone. At that same time, the phone began ringing at the art studio and Bobo answered, having a short conversation with a man on the other line before hanging up. She then called Angie back, who noted that Bobo told her that the man had a home and some property outside of town that he was interested in trading for her property on McNeil Street. Angie explained, quote, "She said that his house was 9 miles out on the Taylor Highway. I asked her if she would want a house that far out since it would require so many trips in order to fix it up. She said she might want it for her boyfriend. I think she told me that this man had offered to take a taxi to her studio because his car was in the Pontiac place. She started to tell him to walk across the street and she would meet him at the Easy Mart. She told me that she would be over to my house at 1:30 p.m. if she were through. She never acted as if anything was unusual. She was rushing the conversation and acting as if she was getting ready to leave right away." End quote. At the conclusion of this phone call, Bobo made a statement which, at the time, didn't feel all that urgent, but given what would happen later, has made everyone wonder if perhaps the 25-year-old had some reservations about this potential buyer. Angie would tell authorities that before hanging up the phone, Bobo said, "Come looking for me if I'm not back this afternoon." Much of this call is corroborated by Bobo's sister Becky, who noted that she heard her sister tell the man that she would pick him up, and she also heard the chilling request to look for her if she didn't return. 5 to 10 minutes after making plans with the unknown caller, Bobo called another friend to break their plans to get together, noting that she had a house showing instead. Reportedly, she explained to this other friend that she would see her at a swimming party later that afternoon. Sometime between 11:20 and 11:30 a.m., Bobo left the art studio, and it's presumed that she made the short 4-minute drive north to the family home on Sioux Street to change clothes, not wanting to meet the buyer wearing cut-off jean shorts and a t-shirt. I say this is presumed because no one knows for certain when exactly Bobo stopped home to change her clothes, but the clothing she had been wearing earlier in the day were located at the house after her disappearance. From this point forward, I should note, the timeline gets a little weird. There's a lot happening at similar times, and much of it is based on witness statements, so all of the times are rather approximate. There will likely be some discrepancies stated, but we'll address those later on in the episode. Between 11:30 and 11:40, a witness spots Bobo pulling into the Easy Mart, at which time an unidentified man got into her car. The vehicle was difficult to miss. She drove a 1976 Buick Special with a custom blue paint job. Also, between 11:30 and 11:40, another witness reported seeing Bobo and the unidentified man arriving at the McNeil Street house. This witness stated that the two spoke outside of the home for a few minutes and then went inside. Around 10 minutes later, the two emerged from the home and drove away from the property. If this witness is correct with the time, this would have Bobo and the unknown man leaving the McNeil house between 11:40 and 11:50. 10 minutes later, at approximately 12 p.m., an employee of Jordan Pontiac Buick stated that he saw Bobo and an unknown man pulling out from a gas station then located on Main Street. After pulling out, the vehicle is noted as proceeding west, last being seen stopped at a traffic light at the intersection of Main and Pine Streets, 0.3 of a mile from the Easy Mart. All of these locations are in close proximity, and even given the modern geography of Magnolia, the drive from the Easy Mart to the McNeil Street home, back to the Mart, to the gas station on Main, and then to the intersection of Main and Pine covers just 1.3 miles, and it would take no more than 6 minutes to travel to those locations in that order. If Bobo and the unknown man did spend 10 minutes in the house, give or take, they would have left sometime between 11:50 and 11:55. It's then another 4-minute drive to the intersection of Main and Pine, putting the vehicle there around 11:59 or 12 o'clock, which fits with the witness account. The next alleged sighting of Bobo takes place at approximately 12:05. This is when Harry Irwin, the Columbia County tax collector, is baling hay on his property and claims to see a vehicle fitting the descriptions of Bobo's swerving along the roadway as a man and woman appear to be fighting for control of the wheel. The distance from the intersection to the location of Mr. Irwin is a 6-minute drive, which fits in with the 12:05-ish sighting. Bobo is never seen again after 12:05, and no one knows with any level of certainty where she and the unknown man may have gone. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Sue arrived home with another of her daughters and noted that Bobo wasn't there. She would later state that she found her daughter's absence somewhat concerning, as she wasn't aware of any plan she had to be out, and Bobo almost always left behind a note explaining where she had gone to. Sue's concern began changing into worry over the next few hours, as several of Bobo's friends called the house looking for her. Then, at 4:30 p.m., Angie Pendrick called the house somewhat annoyed that Bobo hadn't showed up for their get-together. It was during this conversation that Angie explained the circumstances about the potential buyer to Sue, and she became very worried for her daughter's safety. Hoping to track her down, Sue drove over to the art studio but found the lights off and the door closed and locked. Considering what Angie had told her about the earlier chat with Bobo, she then made her way to the Easy Mart, but no one there remembered seeing the 25-year-old. From there, Sue walked across the street to Jordan Pontiac Buick. The dealership was preparing to close as it was nearing 5 p.m. Speaking to the manager, Sue inquired about the prospective home buyer who had told Bobo that his car was being worked on at that location. The manager then explained to the frantic mother that there were no cars being serviced at that time, and he had no knowledge of anyone dropping their car off at the dealership that whole day. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Sue went back to her car and drove home to make a few calls looking for her daughter. Just after 5 p.m., the manager of the dealership closed up the business, locking the door behind him. He then got into his car, planning to drive home, and he proceeded north onto East Main Street and then made a right turn onto North Dudney, passing the Easy Mart on his right. Looking out the driver's side window to his left, the man quickly spotted a vehicle which closely resembled Bobo's. She had purchased the car from his dealership, and he remembered the custom paint job. The man pulled into the parking lot of Smitty's Food Mart directly across the street from the Easy Mart. Approaching the vehicle, he pulled open the driver's side door, which was unlocked, and leaned into the car. Reaching in, he opened the center console and saw paperwork with Bobo's name on it, confirming that this was in fact her car. Armed with this information, the man got back into his vehicle and made the quick drive over to the Shinn family home. Arriving at the home on Sioux Street, the manager explained to Bobo's mother that he'd found the car, and she immediately picked up the phone and called the police to report her daughter missing. Shortly after that report came in, then Arkansas State Trooper Ron Stovall stopped by the Magnolia Police Department and was informed about the missing person's call. He later explained, saying, quote, "If I recall correctly, Jim McInnes, a city officer at that time, made mention that he thought he had spotted her car down behind Smitty's. He and I drove down there, and it was her car." End quote. According to the official record, Trooper Stovall was the first officer on the scene at approximately 6:30 p.m., and when he saw the car, he got a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. Before making any big moves, Stovall contacted Lieutenant Finis Duval with the State Police Criminal Investigation Division, then located in the City of Hope. Finis agreed to come down that night and begin working the scene alongside Stovall and State Police investigator Russell Welsh, who had been assigned as chief investigator. Bobo's car was found sitting in a parking space of the lot of Smitty's Food Mart, approximately 150 yards from the Easy Mart where she had originally picked up the unknown buyer. Examination of the car revealed several interesting details which gave detectives the belief that Bobo had likely been the victim of some kind of foul play. The doors had been left unlocked, the windows were rolled down, and the keys were dangling from the ignition. Bobo's purse, which has been described as both blue canvas or blue denim, was located inside the vehicle, and it appeared the contents had been dumped out on the passenger seat, with some spilling onto the floorboard. Her wallet was there, cherry red with a snapping clasp, and inside were business cards, photos, and a small amount of cash. Her driver's license was located along with a stick of Wrigley spearmint gum in a black and white wrapper. Additional items found included a bank receipt, a cheap black paper address book, and a cigarette case which contained an open pack of cigarettes, Kent Golden Lights, with only one cigarette inside. Bobo's sunglasses were found on the seat, which was concerning to the family as they noted that she wore contact lenses, and those contact lenses caused mild light sensitivity, so she never went anywhere without her shades. Next to them was a copy of The Thornbirds, a 1977 novel by Colleen McCullough. Perhaps one of the more fascinating yet cryptic clues came in the form of Bobo's shoes. The white pair of size 8 tennis shoes were located on the floorboard of the driver's side, somewhat shoved up under the pedals. Mike Lowe, an Arkansas State Police investigator, had a few ideas about the placement of the shoes, later telling the Batesville Guard, quote, "These shoes were found kind of up and under the brake and accelerator. A lot of girls will be driving along and take one shoe and reach over and kick off their shoes and drive in their bare feet or socks. That's how these shoes were. She felt relatively comfortable with the person in the car with her." End quote. For their part, members of the Shinn family didn't agree with Lowe's analysis. Her older sister Linda stated that she had never known Bobo to take her shoes off while driving or to drive without shoes at any time in the past. Sue had another idea, considering the belief that Bobo had gone home to change. She explained, quote, "I feel like she might have run home and changed her clothes and changed her shoes in the car. She did that sometimes when she was in a hurry." End quote. Two items, conspicuous by their absence, were Bobo's appointment book and a yellow air mattress she often used when sunbathing at public pools. Investigators theorized at the time that the suspect's name or other information leading to his identity may have been contained within the appointment book, causing him to take it. It was also possible, though, that the book had been lost during some kind of a struggle, which may have occurred elsewhere if indeed an abduction had taken place. What sinister implications there were from the absence of the air mattress were not commented on publicly. While the contents within the car implied certain possibilities, the exterior told its own cryptic story. Dust, dirt, and scratch marks were found on both sides of the car, as well as the undercarriage. The paint near the rear left fender had sustained deep scratches, and particles of seed fragments were recovered in the score line. The scratches appeared to have been caused by low-lying bushes, brush, and branches, suggesting the vehicle had been driven off the road and through a wooded area. The off-road travel was further confirmed by the discovery of grass seeds in the car's radiator and pine needles trapped in and under the grille. There were also reportedly several sliced pieces of grass found inside the car. Investigator Mike Lowe noted, quote, "The vehicle had been driven across a hay meadow because the belly pan was wiped clean and the doors had been opened, and when they closed the doors, it snapped some of the grass off." End quote. Once the initial examination of the car was completed, the vehicle was taken into police custody and transferred to the Arkansas State Crime Lab in Little Rock. At the time, the lab, which had only been created 1 year earlier, operated out of the state police building, taking the entire third floor and part of the basement. Forensic examiners spent a great deal of time processing the vehicle. In addition to dusting for prints, the vehicle was thoroughly vacuumed, and all particles collected from the carpet and upholstery were analyzed through additional testing. Ultimately, much of the lab report showed negative results, but a few key pieces of evidence were recovered. Several unidentified hairs were found, and 3 partial prints were lifted from the rearview mirror and the glass of the driver's side door. Unfortunately, they could not eliminate the possibility that the prints belonged to Bobo, as they did not have hers on record for comparison. Investigator Lowe explained, quote, "These are the latent print impressions that came off her car. They tell us that they're female, about 90% sure that they're female. We think they're Bobo's, but she was never fingerprinted, so we have no way of knowing for sure." End quote. They did attempt to get her prints, going to the family home and dusting items that had only ever been handled by her, but they were unable to obtain a print detailed enough to be used for ruling the others in or out. To date, the prints recovered from the car have never been identified. There were, of course, a few issues with the state of the vehicle and analysis of the scene. Firstly, it was known for certain that the manager from Jordan Pontiac had entered the vehicle and fumbled through the papers. Police did not know if anyone else may have opened the car or moved items around inside. While the contents of Bobo's purse being dumped out could have suggested a struggle, or perhaps that the suspect was looking for something suspicious, there were some doubts about the legitimacy of that purse being dumped out. According to Chief Investigator Russell Welsh, they began wondering if maybe the purse had been dumped by an onlooker or perhaps even one of the police officers who had been first on scene. According to Welch, that suspicion was confirmed when 2 weeks later, a Magnolia police officer admitted that he had dumped out the purse while searching for identification to confirm the vehicle's owner. Investigator Mike Lowe would later state that all of the officers he had questioned who had been present that night denied ever touching the purse. Discovery of the car and subsequent examinations by local and state authorities, while not quite conclusive, convinced most working the case early on that Bobo had likely been the victim of foul play, perhaps an abduction. Action was taken quickly, as within hours of the car being found, Mike Kennard, then 13th Judicial Prosecuting Attorney, reached out for assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At the time, the FBI agreed to handle and investigate any leads that might come in from states outside of Arkansas, leaving that part of the investigation to state and local authorities. For investigators within the state, they were determined to get down to a more concise timeline of events, as well as aiming to interview potential witnesses in and around locations where it was known Bobo had visited in the hours leading up to her disappearance. While some were canvassing areas, Others were involved in boots-on-the-ground searches, which targeted more rural areas of Columbia County to the north, west, and south of Magnolia. According to multiple reports, Bobo planned to pick up the unknown man at the Easy Mart the day she disappeared, and so investigators went down to the small store to interview employees as well as customers who may have been there around the same time as Bobo. The clerk, working behind the counter, explained to police that she had seen a man using the payphone outside of the store at around 11:15 a.m. She described the individual as a white male, clean-shaven with a potbelly and dark curly hair. The employee was asked and agreed to sit down with a composite artist to create a sketch of the unknown man. That sketch would become just one of many contained within the police file, some allegedly of the same man and others of different individuals described by other witnesses. Mike Lowe would later note the reliability of the Easy Mart clerk, saying, quote, "She was a pretty good little witness. She got a pretty good look at him, and she remembered a lot. Was real calm." End quote. However, there was another witness who was able to provide investigators with even more information. This witness was the daughter of the store's manager, who was present and remembered seeing the man using the payphone. According to her, the caller had originally entered the store and asked for change, a quarter specifically, so that he could use the phone. She went on to tell police that the man had spoken on the phone for approximately 5 minutes. She described him as a white male, thought to be in his mid-20s, standing approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with dark, naturally curly hair. She's described him as heavy-built and slightly overweight. She was also able to report that the man wore a white shirt, possibly a t-shirt, and faded blue jeans. Asked if there was anything specific about the man which stood out to her, the witness replied that he had a slow, lumbering walk, which she went on to describe as lazy-like. Learning about the call made from the phone, authorities reached out to the phone company in hopes of learning additional details such as when precisely it was made and how long it lasted. Unfortunately, due to the way the telephone system was at the time, since the call had been made to a local number, no record of it was kept. Heading west across the street from the Easy Mart back to Smitty's Food, investigators spoke with several employees who were working the afternoon and early evening the day of the disappearance. 2 of the people they spoke with delivered very similar stories, each reporting independently that while they hadn't seen Bobo or her alleged abductor, they did see the car. According to their statements, they first noticed the missing woman's car parked in the spot where it would later be found by police at approximately 1 p.m. Another employee, working as a stock boy at the time, told police he first noticed the car in the parking lot at 1:30. Given that other witnesses would place Bobo and the unknown man in her car driving through town between 12 and 12:05 p.m., the 1 p.m. sighting of the car in the parking lot would suggest that, whatever the crime, it had been conducted in a little over an hour, accounting for driving the vehicle back to the food mart. Later authorities would narrow the timeline even more, determining that between the last sighting of the missing woman and the 1 p.m. sighting of her car, no more than 57 minutes could have passed. This would therefore imply that, taken outside of town, the suspect could have traveled no further than 29 minutes before returning, and even that estimate leaves no time for whatever was done to Bobo herself. Investigators would find another witness, this time someone who claimed to have seen both Bobo and the unidentified man during their stop at the McNeil Street home less than 30 minutes before the 25-year-old's disappearance. While this person's statements would play a major role in guiding the early days, or even years, of the investigation, more than 4 decades later, law enforcement officials would note that at best, they consider the account unreliable, and perhaps at worst, completely inaccurate. Regardless, this witness ultimately became a key source for detectives, and his statements functioned to bulwark earlier theories that would fail to live up to either the passage of time nor the stringent critiques from experienced investigators who pointed out multiple inconsistencies which remain unaddressed to this day. The witness was a carpenter who was working on a home across the street from the McNeil Street home on the morning of the disappearance. By his own statements, the witness placed himself approximately 75 feet from the property that day. According to his account, at approximately 11 a.m., he saw a blue car fitting the descriptions of Bobo's Buick Special pulling up to the property, arriving from the west. This time created some confusion as investigators knew for certain that at 11 a.m., Bobo was still at her studio awaiting a call from the potential buyer. When pressed further for the time, the witness acknowledged he didn't look at his watch, and he could have seen the car arriving any time that day between 10:30 and 11:30. The carpenter went on to state that a woman exited the blue car, and he later identified Bobo from a photo as the woman he saw that morning. According to him, a second vehicle pulled up within minutes of Bobo, which he described as being a Pontiac, any year between 1969 and 1979, dark green with a lighter green vinyl top. He also suggested it could have possibly been a 1972 Bonneville Catalina or maybe a heavier model Pontiac like a Le Mans. This second car reportedly arrived from the east. The witness stated that a man emerged from the second vehicle who he described as being a white male, 25 to 28 years old, standing 6'1" to 6'2" and weighing between 215 and 225 pounds. He went on to say that the man was heavy and fairly wide across the shoulders. He had dark brown collar-length hair and a medium-length beard with a mustache. He was wearing a baseball-type mesh cap. The carpenter stated that the woman and the man proceeded into the house, were inside for between 10 and 15 minutes, and then exited. At that point, he claimed the woman got into her car, the man into his, and both drove off from the property heading west on McNeil. There were a lot of questions about this witness's statements, primarily his insistence that Bobo and the unknown man arrived in separate vehicles. This directly conflicts with statements from other witnesses who spoke with and or were present when the man called Bobo at the art studio. How, investigators wondered, was it possible that she needed to pick up the potential buyer and was actually seen with him in her car, if indeed they had arrived in two separate vehicles and his was allegedly being worked on at the Pontiac dealership? In fact, an employee of Jordan Pontiac Buick would later tell police that he was on break when he saw Bobo arrive at the Easy Mart across the street. He explained, quote, "Sometime around the middle of the day on Thursday, July 20, 1978, I just happened to notice a man standing by the telephone outside the Easy Mart across the street. A car pulled up to him, which looked just like Bobo's car." End quote. Unfortunately, the employee didn't get a great look at the caller, who he would only describe as a white male, 25 to 30 years of age. In addition to these discrepancies, it was noted by investigators that not only was the carpenter 75 feet from the property at the time he saw the comings and goings, he had poor eyesight and wore very thick glasses. Then, there was the issue of his sighting being comprised in the form of mistaken identity. 2 houses down from the property at 718 East McNeil lived a local man who worked as a welder. He was in his late 20s, wore a mesh baseball-style hat, had a beard, and drove a dark green 1968 Chevy. This man was interviewed by police and confirmed that he left work for his lunch break that day, as he often did, and arrived home on East McNeil Street at approximately 11:30 a.m. According to investigators, this guy fit the details of the carpenter's description, but when he was shown photos of the welder and his car, he denied that he had been mistaken, and instead insisted that Bobo had arrived separately from the unknown man in the unidentified dark green car. Investigators were less certain about the discrepancy, yet the carpenter's description would be taken as gospel. A detailed composite drawing was created based on his description, and this unknown, large and heavy, bearded man with long hair, a hat, and a dark green vehicle became the target of a massive search. Tipsters began calling in, delivering the names of every bearded man they knew in the area. Police set up roadblocks, questioned people who drove by prominent locations in the case over the course of the next few days. Anyone behind the wheel of a green vehicle and any driver or passenger with a beard was given special attention. Investigators requested records from the Department of Motor Vehicles and ran down every green car in the area, which closely or even partially matched the description given. As it turned out, it wasn't all that extensive of a search, as there were few of those vehicles registered in and around Magnolia. None of the cars or owners interviewed could be conclusively linked to the crime or to Bobo herself. In the days following the disappearance, expansive searches were conducted, and their size and scope continued to grow. The Magnolia Police, Columbia County Sheriff's Office, State Police, Arkansas National Guard, and FBI scoured rural areas of the county on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It was estimated that Sunday's search, the largest to that point, involved more than 300 individuals who combed the landscape on foot, horseback, and four-wheelers. There were even searches from the sky, with the addition of helicopters operated by the Civil Air Patrol, and the local Citizens Band radio clubs also participated. For the most part, these searches focused in on south and southeastern Columbia County. On the same Sunday that the largest of the searches was executed, authorities received a call from Harry Irwin, the tax collector for Columbia County. Irwin would report at that time that on the day of Bobo's disappearance, he had witnessed a car fitting the description of her Buick Special behaving oddly just outside of town. Irwin, who at the time was baling hay on his property just west of Highway 132, said he saw Bobo's car pass by on the dirt and gravel road, Columbia 32. According to his account, the car was traveling between 10 and 20 miles per hour, and there was a woman at the wheel and a male in the passenger seat. He believed there to have been some kind of a struggle inside as he watched the car swerving from side to side along the road, and he saw what he believed to be a fight for control of the steering wheel between the man and woman. Whether or not Irwin actually was the last witness to see Bobo alive has never been determined, but the sighting would haunt him for the rest of his days. Irwin passed away 2 years later, never knowing with any certainty what exactly he had witnessed that day. Mike Lowe, years later, would note that while they found his account probable, it was difficult to confirm, if possible. He explained, quote, "Harry went to his grave thinking he'd seen the abduction taking place, and he may have. Whether he did or he didn't, we don't know. It was hot, and he had his equipment to keep an eye on. That old farm equipment, it'll buck you if you're not careful. So whether he saw it or not, we'll never know. But he very well could have. And that does put it in a direction that interests us now." End quote. Regardless, there would be multiple searches launched within the area Irwin specified in 1978, and over the years, many more searches would focus in and target that area, not solely for Irwin's sighting, but because there were hay fields and wooded areas that certainly could have been where Bobo's car had been driven off-road. There were, of course, other witnesses who offered up curious, fascinating, or simply unbelievable accounts of what they had seen or heard. A female clerk working at Smitty's told investigators that on the day of the disappearance, she saw two college-aged kids forcing a female into a four-wheel drive vehicle behind the store. According to her, she thought they were just fooling around, so she took no action. Another witness driving through Magnolia that day told authorities he believed he saw Bobo's blue car heading south out of town, but noted he didn't see a passenger or anything suspicious. Monday, July 24th, 4 days after Bobo disappeared, her family hired a Shreveport, Louisiana-based private investigator named Bill Gray. Speaking to the media, Gray announced that the Shinn family were putting up a $25,000 reward for information leading to Bobo's return. It was also noted that the family was installing a special phone line in the house, which would function as a hotline for tipsters to call with whatever information they might have. Speaking for the family, Gray noted that they were not going to stop in their pursuit to bring their beloved daughter and sister home, telling the local media, quote, "We're just trying to do anything we can. Anyone with information is asked to call us. We will keep all information strictly confidential." End quote. On this same day, Chief Investigator Russell Welsh informed the local media that they were seeking a potential witness. Allegedly, on the day of the disappearance, a deaf man was in the area of the Easy Mart selling pencils at the time Bobo picked up the unknown driver. Though they could not say with any certainty if the man had witnessed the pickup, They had been told by additional witnesses that he had been standing within 15 feet from where Bobo and the man had been, and it was believed he might have gotten the closest look at the suspect to date. This story ran in local papers for several days, but if the deaf man was ever identified and interviewed, it was never officially confirmed. Later, in the evening of the 24th, a tip was called in from a bus driver operating out of Shreveport, 80 miles southwest of Magnolia. The driver claimed to have seen a woman, closely fitting Bobo's description, on a run he had made west to Houston, Texas. While investigators worked to track down others on the bus to see whether or not they could support the driver's account, Bobo's brother Jay, her boyfriend Willis Stroop, and her brother-in-law Wayne Newton, no, not that Wayne Newton, traveled to Houston and managed to track down the woman from the bus driver's report. Not only was it not Bobo, but the woman had blonde hair and was traveling with a young child. Though things didn't work out for them, the three were determined to track down every possibility, no matter how far-fetched it might seem. On Tuesday, the 25th, investigator Welch stated that they were just beginning to break the surface on a huge stack of leads that needed to be tracked down. They had received dozens of calls since the disappearance, and a lot of information had been delivered, though much of it probably wouldn't pan out for them, according to Welch, who would tell reporters, quote, "We're checking out everything. I've got a stack of leads here on my desk and we're keeping busy, but so far, nothing." End quote. During this interview, Welch for the first time made mention of a new composite drawing, the one that was created based on the carpenter's description. They hadn't yet revealed that drawing to the public, wanting to show it to other witnesses first, but Welch expressed a lack of confidence, noting that the picture quote-unquote looks like 1,000 people. Days earlier, they had released an extremely vague composite, seemingly based on the descriptions of other witnesses, showing a clean-shaven man, short and heavy, with dark curly hair seemingly matching the man making the phone call at the Easy Mart's payphone. 3 days later, on Friday, July 28th, they officially released the carpenter's sketch. This one was quite different from the original, showing a man standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than 200 pounds. Interestingly, this composite describes the suspect as having dark hair and a dark, red-tinted beard. This adjustment of the beard color was a new detail which had not been previously revealed, although many working the case still believe this was a description of the welder living on McNeil rather than an actual suspect. Following the release of the sketch, the Shinn family also jumped into action, increasing their reward for information from $25,000 to $35,000 the next day, Saturday the 29th. Just for the record, adjusted for inflation, $35,000 in 1978 would be more than $170,000 in 2025 money. Hoping to contribute in whatever way they could, Gresham Shinn informed the media that he had been along on several searches with law enforcement, scouting along roads in Columbia County as well as neighboring Lafayette County. Gresham described his experience, telling reporters, quote, "What you do is, you drive down these little roads, go as far as a car can go, then you have to get out and walk." End quote. The hope was to find the scene of the crime, something investigators had been working without since day one, or perhaps some sign or trace of where Bobo may have been taken. Monday, July 31st, marked the final day of the month and nearly 2 weeks since Bobo had disappeared. Investigators found themselves pulled in countless directions, receiving tips about every bearded man who lived in the area and many who could not be identified, let alone tracked down. Leads took them all over Arkansas and even into Louisiana and Texas. Russell Welch described the tips following the release of the second composite as little more than a witch hunt for any bearded man. He relayed an example of the tips they were working with, explaining that a woman working at a store reported seeing a suspicious bearded man. He explained, quote, "It's hard to follow up on a lead like that, but I went to the store. I talked to the store manager. I've had little old ladies tell me a bearded man drove up next to them at a stop sign and looked at them kind of funny. For a while, everyone who had a beard was a suspect." End quote. Welch himself traveled to Shreveport to question a suspect in another case after local law enforcement expressed that he fit the suspect's description and had committed a similar style crime. However, the detainee had no connections to Magnolia, and Welsh found nothing to place him in town the day of the crime or any time around it. That suspect would go on to be charged with first-degree murder in connection with the killing of Meridian, Mississippi women several weeks prior. Investigators had somewhat of a misinformation problem inhibiting them. All across the country, it was being reported that Bobo was a real estate agent, and any police department dealing with missing or murdered real estate agents called in whenever they arrested a suspect. The problem was, Bobo wasn't a real estate agent, at least not in the same sense. She didn't advertise, her photos weren't in the paper, there was nothing about her local ad that they felt would make her specifically stand out as a target for someone going after real estate agents. As a result, they had to sort through a great many tips and suspects whose MO ultimately did not match that of the man they were seeking in connection with the disappearance. Considering the small-town feel of Magnolia, for the most part, residents struggled to accept the possibility that Bobo could have been targeted by one of their own, and that sense of disbelief even stretched out to some of the investigators, who felt certain that they had to be looking for a stranger, someone passing through the city. It was theorized that Bobo may have not been targeted, but rather was the victim of a drifter or random person who just happened upon her ad for the house on McNeil. For his part, private investigator Bill Gray completely disagreed. There was a lot of talk in the media about Bobo being abducted by what reporters referred to as a random pervert, their words, not mine. Gray felt that the crime hadn't been spur of the moment or improvised, rather saying it seemed more likely that the crime had been thought out and planned. He explained, saying, quote, "A random pervert does not act like that. It's a spontaneous thing. They don't care who they grab." End quote. While true in some cases, over the last 4.5 decades, it's been learned that while some predators target at random, others have specific requirements or desires that the victim must fit before they act. This would be Bill Gray's last media appearance working for the family, as after failing to develop any solid leads or suspects, they moved on. The second PI they hired came out of Dallas, Texas. Joe Daniel Smokey Joe Smith had a notorious reputation which preceded him. He had worked on multiple different roles in law enforcement and law enforcement adjacent positions, including but not limited to bail bondsman and deputy constable. He had also had his run-ins with the law, approximately 30 of them, for everything from communicating threats, verbal abuse, and theft. It was suggested that Smith had success in his private investigations in part because, due to his own sometimes unlawful actions, he had connections to what at the time was referred to as the criminal underworld. Smith had a difficult path cut before him, coming into the case late and needing to do a lot of work to catch up. By mid-August, nearly a month after the disappearance, the case was already grinding down to a standstill for investigators, both local law enforcement and hired privates. The tip line, which had been installed in the Shinn family home, had dried up, from what was once a flood to just drips and drabs, with it being noted that they had dropped from hundreds of calls in the first weeks to less than 10 calls by the early days of August. Multiple witnesses, family members, and friends of Bobo were questioned by police, and a whole slew of polygraph examinations were conducted. In some instances, desperately hoping to enhance information on potential suspects, witnesses were asked to undergo hypnosis in an attempt to sharpen their memories. The search for Bobo and/or her abductor began transforming from an above-board police investigation into a desperate hunt, wherein rights and laws were sometimes not followed by those charged with enforcing them. One example would involve State Police investigator Lieutenant Finis Duval. On Friday, August 18th, the State Police were conducting aerial searches of an area south of Magnolia when they thought they had stumbled upon a key piece of evidence when they spotted a dark green car hidden amongst the trees of a wooded area. Lieutenant Duval arrived at the scene and, without warrant or authority, decided to pry open the vehicle's trunk for any signs of Bobo, but instead, he found an empty space and no traces of evidence. The car was confirmed to belong to Magnolia local Bill Holmes, And while police considered him a possible suspect at the time, they quickly realized a major flaw. Holmes had reported his car stolen 2 weeks before Bobo had disappeared. Lieutenant Duvall's actions caused quite an uproar in Magnolia, where people were already beginning to feel like the investigation was becoming a different kind of animal. Aggressive searches for any and all bearded men resulted in a lot of the male population shaving off their beards to avoid what they described as harassment, not just from local authorities, but also friends and neighbors who became suspicious of them. Ultimately, Lieutenant Duvall's actions and Holmes' complaint would be heard before the Columbia County Quorum Court, a legislative body in the state of Arkansas made up of 15 justices of the peace serving 2-year terms. Holmes himself spoke before the court, pointing to the unlawfulness of Duvall's actions and asking out loud, "Are they going to tear up every green car they see?" These actions and the backlash erupting from them seems to have weighed heavily on law enforcement who, for lack of a better description, began reining things in, and public discussion and media interviews about the case became fewer and fewer. As police grew quiet, Gresham Shinn applied ample pressure to local officials, stopping in daily to the city-county investigator's office. Shinn reached out for assistance, speaking multiple times to the head of the state police as well as Washington, D.C. investigators. Shinn even spoke with the Arkansas governor, hoping to get more done about the investigation, and partially in response, a task force was sent from Little Rock to Magnolia. However, they left within a week, noting that there was almost no solid evidence to work from and leads had previously dried up. Chief Investigator Welsh was conducting a very thorough but necessarily methodical search, and the task force simply wasn't designed for such an investigation. Despite the continued investigation and additional searches of areas all around Columbia County, little progress was made, and the case continued to dwindle. August and September would yield no solid results, and by the arrival of October, nearly 3 months since the disappearance, Welsh acknowledged that they had run down more than 300 leads, and not a single one of them had helped advance the case. Seemingly, state and local authorities agreed that things were drying up, and the state police reduced the amount of officers assigned to the case from 6 to 1, Russell Welch. Still, Welsh noted, the investigation had been expansive, and beyond the known searches, he confirmed that law enforcement had scoured more than 1,400 ponds in the area, but had found nothing. For the most part, the year of 1978 would come to its conclusion with little if any solid developments. In May of 1979, 10 months following the disappearance, Chief Investigator Russell Welsh officially left the case, transferring out of Magnolia to the city of Mena, some 150 miles away. At this point in time, State Police Investigator Mike Lowe took over. Lowe had already been working the case for a period of time prior to taking over. He came into the investigation with great drive and determination, as well as a personal interest. Lowe was a Magnolia native and had attended Southern Arkansas University during the same period as Bobo. They even shared a history class together and knew one another on an acquaintance basis. Unfortunately, by the time Lowe officially took over, the case was already rather cold, and original leads and pursuits needed to be revisited. October of 1979, 15 months since the disappearance, would become a pivot point in this case. It was this month when the Shinn family terminated their agreement with PI Smokey Joe Smith. They quickly moved on to their third PI, this time hiring William Deere, also of Dallas, Texas. Deere quickly traveled to Magnolia and brought 5 investigators along with him. He set up an office at the Coachman's Inn, one of the hotels the Shinn family had worked on. The private investigator quickly learned that things in Little Magnolia didn't quite operate the way he was used to. He explained, quote, "Magnolia was different. It was and is a very private, closed little town. Usually, you go into small towns like that, offer money, and people will talk. I've been known to cut money in half and say, you'll get the rest when the information checks out. I'll have scotch tape for them when it does." And in the 1970s in Magnolia, $25,000 was a lot of money, but in Magnolia, the money didn't work. End quote. One of Deer's first acts was the creation of a brochure which contained many photos of Bobo and went into the details of her disappearance. These brochures were plastered all over town, in businesses, in store windows, on trees, and phone booths. Deer and his team even spent time at Smitty's Food Mart, where the car had been found, handing out the brochures to shoppers and passers-by. Included in the brochure were mentions of the Shinn family reward and numbers to call with information. Unfortunately, the arrival of William Deer and his aggressive investigation tactics would deliver a result that never seems to assist but only ever hinders the search for missing persons. The case would become, as Deer would later describe it, a political football. On Friday, November 2nd, Deer announced to local media that he expected a break in the case within 1 week. He and his team, beginning that weekend, planned to search approximately 75 wells located throughout the area. They would also focus on ponds and other bodies of water, reportedly using what, at the time, they called a new type of bloodhound that can detect human bones, or what we would call today a cadaver dog. According to Deer, there was more information available in Magnolia than what local authorities were reporting, claiming that he had received several letters from locals providing additional details. 3 weeks later, Deer reported that he had developed a suspect, who he would describe as both a genius and a brilliant guy. Deer's suspect would later be identified as 27-year-old Michael Glenn Morse of Stamps, a city 20 miles northwest of Magnolia, located in Lafayette County. Deer claimed that he had statements from multiple people which had led him to Morse, including witness accounts that the man had made statements about the crime, looked very similar to the composite drawing, and had allegedly shaved off his beard in the days following the disappearance. Morse's name has been bandied about previously, mostly through local rumor and speculation. At the time, there was a structure located in the woods south of Stamps known as the Hippie Hut. Morse was reportedly associated with that spot, and Deer theorized that Bobo had likely been taken there. Even more than 4 decades later, ghost stories persist about the missing 25-year-old haunting that spot. There was, of course, one major issue with investigating Morse as a potential suspect. On Sunday, October 15, 1978, Morse was found dead along Lafayette County Road 34, 2.5 miles north of Stamps. Reportedly, he died as a result of a self-inflicted gunshot wound fired from a .90 Winchester pump-action .22 caliber rifle. The rifle was rather long for what some would consider a probable weapon to use for a self-inflicted shot, and at least according to some, the scene itself did not agree with the official ruling. Rumors circulated around the death, with Morse's family denying it had been self-inflicted, and with other officers present at the scene allegedly telling people that Morse had been found with his hands folded across his chest, suggesting the scene had been staged. But what actually is rumor versus legitimate fact is quite unclear. According to Deer, his key witness was the much-debated carpenter for whom the second composite sketch had been constructed. Another witness supporting the accusation was a former employer of Morse's who claimed that on the date of the disappearance, Morse had taken the day off because he claimed he needed to meet with his real estate agent in Magnolia. Morse's father, Dewey Morse, passed away at the age of 59 on Friday, June 2, 1978, just 5 weeks before Bobo's disappearance, and William Deer would later state that he had been informed by a psychic that Morse had killed her and laid her body in the grave with his father, specifically that she would be found lying on top of the casket. According to Deer, he reached out to both Dewey's wife and Michael's widow and was granted permission to dig up the grave and conduct a search. On Tuesday, November 21st, Deer and his investigators, along with several representatives of local and state law enforcement, arrived at Columbia County's Western Cemetery in Emerson, 18 miles southwest of Magnolia. While law enforcement had made it clear, publicly, that they did not think Deer was on the right track, they still thought they should be present. Deer did, however, have some support from prominent names in the area. Sam Tatum, director of the State Crime Commission, joined with his investigation and publicly supported him, as did Tommy Robinson, director of the State Department of Public Safety. Ultimately, though, after the dirt had all been turned over, there was no sign of Bobo located, and before Deer could even address the growing line of reporters gathering at the cemetery, law enforcement officials were already getting into their cars and leaving, noting that the lead had been little more than a rumor that had successfully suckered in this supposedly skilled and experienced private investigator. Despite the lack of a result, Sam Tatum continued to support Deer, suggesting to the media that the lack of finding Bobo's remains did not deter him nor Deer from their beliefs that Morse was responsible. He would later tell the Times, quote, "Until we find a body, we don't have a crime. However, there is very little doubt left that we know who did it." End quote. In one interview, Tatum described Morse as a former acquaintance of Bobo's, though friends and family never confirmed this. By my own research, the only connection I can find between the two is that they both attended Southern Arkansas University and there was some overlap. However, the grave exhumation would bring a lot of heat and attention down on Deer and Tatum, as Morse's mother, Corinne, and his widow, Norma, filed a $2 million lawsuit against both men, claiming an invasion of privacy and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. According to the two women, while Deer had approached them about exhuming the grave, he had lied about his reasons and never suggested that he believed Michael had played any role in the crime. At the same time Deer was making claims about Morse being involved, local law enforcement made it clear to the media that not only had Deer failed to share any of the so-called evidence he possessed, he also hadn't spoken with anyone at the prosecutor's office. Prosecutor Mike Kennard, asked about Deer's allegations, noted that he had been trying to get information out of the private investigator, but found him secretive and unwilling to share. Kennard told the Shreveport Journal that he knew the suspect Deer and Tatum had in mind and, quote, "I intend to see that Mr. Deer brings to my office any evidence that he has which may point to a crime being committed, and if he refuses, I'll exercise the subpoena powers. If they have evidence regarding the crime or evidence which points to a specific suspect, then I expect them to make it available to this office." End quote. Still, Deer did not present any evidence to Kennard or state or local officials. Columbia County Sheriff John Blair joined Kennard in his calls for transparency, noting that he and his office had worked the case hard for the previous year and 4 months, and they found it not only insulting, but possibly illegal for the private investigator to be concealing alleged evidence of a crime. Much as Kennard had, Blair called Deer's bluff, saying to reporters, quote, "This situation has gotten out of hand as far as publicity goes. If Deer has got all the evidence that's been reported in the papers, then why hasn't he brought this to me?" End quote. Sam Tatum, in response to the request for evidence, told the media that he had shared everything he had with Sheriff Blair, as well as his own father, Wade Tatum, the then sheriff of Lafayette County. According to Sam Tatum, it was Sheriff Blair's responsibility to take that evidence to the prosecutor's office. But there was only one problem. Sheriff Blair denied that Tatum had ever delivered even a scrap of evidence to him, saying, quote, "I don't know how much they've got. They may have a full deck, but if they do, I sure don't know about it." End quote. In regard to this discrepancy, Tatum would later say that, in actuality, all of his evidence was in his head, and that Deer was the one who was actually in physical possession of it. According to Prosecutor Kennard, the first time they had heard about any of this so-called evidence was when William Deer held a press conference which Kennard watched from his office alongside Sheriff Blair and Lieutenant Finis Duval. According to Kennard, all three men had the same reaction. They were perplexed by Deer's statements and had no idea what the alleged evidence he had was. Tatum began to pull back slightly, stating that he was involved in the investigation as a private citizen, not as the director of the State Crime Commission. Further, he noted he was very experienced with law enforcement, having grown up around it and having been commissioned as a deputy sheriff in both Columbia and Lafayette counties. Kennard replied that, given those statements, Tatum had no statutory authority to be conducting or participating in criminal investigations, nor was he vested with the power of arrest. Frustrated, Kennard told reporters, quote, "If Sammy is working for the sheriff of Columbia County, it seems strange to me that the sheriff was as perplexed as I was. And if Sammy has entered into some sort of investigatory cooperation with Bill Deere, then they should be turning over their evidence to the proper law enforcement authorities." End quote. The war of words from both sides would continue in the media over the course of the next few weeks, and while public support initially stood behind William Deere, the more time passed without him handing over evidence, the more people began to doubt the veracity of his claims. Many people had heard the rumors about Michael Morse possibly being involved, but no one had produced a shred of evidence to support that claim. A few weeks later, in early December, reporters asked Kennard if he still intended to subpoena the evidence in Deere's possession, but Kennard dismissed the possibility. He noted that, as far as he and investigators were concerned, Deere didn't have any evidence to support his wild theories, and it would be a waste of time and taxpayer funds to subpoena him. Russell Welsh, the former head of the case, was contacted about the possibility of Morse having been involved and replied that he found that highly unlikely. Welsh noted that they had previously interviewed Morse following an anonymous tip saying that he matched the suspect's description. According to Welsh, Morse did not match the description and also had a solid alibi for the day of the crime. Robert Compton, a lawyer hired by the Morse family, said Deere and Tatum's actions had been despicable, and they were merely trying to point the finger at a man who wasn't around to defend himself in some desperate attempt to claim a reward and the prestige for having solved this case. For some, that didn't seem like such a stretch. William Deere had previously garnered a great deal of praise for solving another missing persons case. He had been hired on to locate a 16-year-old from a prominent Michigan family who had disappeared, and Deere made a lot of statements about the case in local papers. When the 16-year-old saw the story, he immediately called home, not realizing his family believed him to be missing. For his part, Deere took credit for solving the case within just a few days. Regardless of how much truth there were to any of the claims made by Deere or the witnesses who had gone to him, Mike Kennard determined it was in the best interest of everyone for the state police to conduct a more thorough, albeit post-mortem investigation into Michael Morse and the possibility of his involvement. Lead investigator Mike Lowe, Lieutenant Finis Duval, and Richard Branch of the state police interviewed more than a dozen people throughout the investigation, and everything they learned led them to believe that Morse had played no role in the crime. While they could find no solid evidence to confirm he had not been involved, they couldn't find anything to suggest that he was. During the investigation, they reviewed all records connected to Morse and found that he had previously been interviewed not once, but twice by two different law enforcement officers. Multiple witnesses signed statements saying that, at the time of the disappearance, Morse had been clean-shaven and did not fit the description of the suspect. However, two women, both working as secretaries for ASU, stated that Morse had come in to re-enroll in classes on Wednesday, July 26, 1978, 6 days after the disappearance, and that he had a beard at the time. In fact, they noted that he had complained to them that he believed he was previously questioned by police because he had a beard. For Lieutenant Duval, it was another example of the complexity of the case and the contradictory information they had to work with, as he would tell the Batesville Guard, quote, "We've got people who will swear that he did not have a beard at the time, and here are two people who will swear that he did." End quote. Now here's where things take an interesting turn. Duval went on to note that following the first interview Morse participated in, the officer who questioned him reported the discussion as a negative interview, which Duval explained by saying a negative interview means the officer has ruled out the person being questioned. According to Duval, when this officer was asked why he had ruled Morse out, he couldn't remember what his reasoning was. The second interview had been conducted by a familiar name to this case, former Chief Investigator Russell Welch. Welch also ruled Morse out, and when asked why, he told Duvall that Morse had given him what he felt was an airtight alibi. However, when asked what that alibi was, Welch couldn't remember and apparently made no mention of it in his original report. So here, you have two investigators, independent of one another, clearing Morse of involvement, yet neither can remember why. You'd think someone's alibi, especially if it's airtight, might be the kind of thing you'd write down in your report, but what do I know? I'm no detective. But that's not all. There's another little nugget of information regarding interviews with Morse that I personally found myself struck by. It's related in one news article, pretty much as an almost throwaway line, but it rings to me as very interesting. According to the Magnolia Banner News, in an article published decades after the crime, Russell Welch claimed that while he had interviewed Morse prior to his death, it might actually not have been in relation to the disappearance. Instead, Welch suggested, the interview may actually have been the result of a call police had received from the Shinn family. Allegedly, after speaking to police the first time, Morse was really upset about being questioned, and he proceeded to make a quote-unquote vicious phone call to Gresham Shinn, where he shouted and expressed his anger about being bothered by investigators. So, you have a possible suspect identified by multiple witnesses as matching the description of the suspect. At the same time, you have multiple witnesses saying the exact opposite about him. Digging deeper, there are a few interesting tidbits about Morse which were not at the time made publicly available, but which came out over the next few decades. Firstly, Morse was allegedly a diagnosed schizophrenic who believed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. He was, at the time, supposedly under the care of a psychiatrist who operated out of the city of El Dorado, 35 miles east of Magnolia. Reportedly, Morse was prescribed an antipsychotic medication that he needed to stay on. According to Deere, he had originally told the media that the tip he'd received that led to exhuming Morse's father's grave was given to him by a psychic, but in order to protect his actual witness, he had lied. Deere later stated that a nurse who worked for the El Dorado psychiatrist was actually the person who had called him with the tip. According to the nurse, Michael Morse himself stated that he had been involved in Bobo's abduction and murder, and that is why she contacted Deere. She was not the only person who told Deere that they had overheard Morse speaking about his involvement in the crime, but whoever the other witnesses were, they've never been named nor have they come forward publicly as far as we know. For Deere, Michael Morse is his only and primary suspect. He and his team of investigators came to this conclusion following multiple searches, including lowering themselves down into old abandoned wells and complete interviews with between 500 and 600 people. Mike Lowe, state police, local authorities, and even Bobo's family disagree and do not believe that Michael Morse played any role in the disappearance. That is pretty much how things stand to this day when it comes to the possibility that Michael Morse could have been involved. He's officially been cleared by investigators for reasons no one can remember, and while the behavior of private investigator William Deere might not be exactly by the book, he did obtain statements from witnesses who confirmed their belief that Morse was involved. Despite the growing debate about the reliability of the carpenter's eyewitness account, he signed a written statement confirming that he identified Michael Morse as the man he saw Bobo with. That statement reads in part, quote, "On November 12, 1979, I was shown several photographs of different male subjects by William C. Deere and Associates of Dallas, Texas. At this time, I voluntarily state that I have positively, without a doubt, identified a photograph of one Michael G. Morse as being the male subject I saw with Miss Shinn in the 700 block of East McNeil Street in Magnolia, Arkansas at about 11:30 a.m. on July 20th, 1978. End quote. Lead investigator Mike Lowe, however, doubted the ability of the carpenter to make a positive identification, especially considering more than a year had passed since he saw the suspect. Lowe questioned the claim, saying, quote, "Could you identify somebody you saw for just a few minutes 16 months before, especially if it was somebody you didn't know? No, you probably couldn't. When doing a photo lineup, you lay the photos out, and if you keep looking at one, or touching one, or signaling to one in some way or another, your witness will too. And what other photos did he use? Did the other people in those pictures match the suspect's description? You can't put 4 pictures of a clean-shaven guy in and 1 picture of a bearded guy. You can't do that, and I don't know what kind of lineup he conducted." End quote. Deer, in subsequent interviews, would claim that the case was never solved not because of a lack of knowledge or effort, but because of a battle for credit. In his opinion, local and state investigators did not want him to come in from out of town and solve the case from under their noses. He argued that police and prosecutors had done everything they could to sabotage his investigation, even going so far as to pressure witnesses. He explained, saying, quote, "They'd follow me around, see who I was talking to, and tell them not to talk to me. I think they knew people would tell me things they weren't likely to tell the police, and they were afraid I would solve it before they did." End quote. While Mike Lowe stated that he never told anyone not to speak to Deer, prosecutor Mike Kennard made a quasi-confirmation when he told local papers that while he didn't tell witnesses not to speak to Deer, he did tell them they had no obligation to speak to the private investigator if they didn't want to. In particular, Kennard stated that he was contacted by members of the Morse family who wanted to know if they were legally required to answer Deer's questions. In January of 1980, William Deer was interviewed about his role in the investigation, at which time he described it as a political football, saying, quote, "The case is being used as a political tool to further someone's political ambitions. Kennard wanted everything turned over to him. He wanted to put it all up on his walls and solve the case himself." End quote. Kennard denied that claim, noting that he was finishing up his current term and then he was retiring from public office altogether. Asked about a desire to boost himself, Kennard simply replied, quote, "All I want is for the Shinns to be satisfied." End quote. At the same time, Kennard expressed some level of resentment towards Deer and the manner in which he conducted his investigation. He was frustrated because Deer had gone to the media with everything he uncovered or believed, but he hadn't gone to the police. According to Kennard, that could damage their ability to prosecute someone in the future. He explained, quote, "If Deer, or somebody taking license with Deer's statements, said Morse was the end of the investigation, any viable suspect in the future would have the stain of us developing a suspect while Deer is pointing the finger at someone else entirely." End quote. The back and forth in the media continued throughout the month of January. Deer moved on to attack the investigation itself, saying that it had not been handled professionally, that evidence was not being stored properly, and that a primary reason he had even been hired was because local authorities didn't pursue the case for months and months at a time. Essentially, Deer claimed that the failure to solve the case or make any arrests was due to a poorly managed investigation, inexperienced officers, and a lack of interest in finding the answers. For their part, investigators entirely denied Deer's claims, with Lieutenant Finis Duval later saying, quote, "I'll just let our investigation stand. As for any stumbling blocks to his investigation, I don't know of any. I don't even know who his witnesses are. I would just like to see this case solved. I don't care who solves it." End quote. For his part, Mike Lowe also disagreed with Deer's statements and noted that he had been and continued to be doing everything he possibly could to work the case and find answers. He desperately wanted to find the suspect, to locate Bobo, and to provide the Shinn family with as much justice and peace as he possibly could. He told the Springfield Leader and Press that more than 300 people had been interviewed in connection with the disappearance. Furthermore, he stated that approximately 50 different people had been considered suspects over the previous years, but all had been eventually ruled out. Showing his records, notes, and paperwork filed in an entire drawer of a filing cabinet, and interviews, sketches, incident reports, and other documents all housed in thick 2-inch binders. Unfortunately, Lowe noted, they were still not in a position to solve the case, but they would never stop pursuing it. Asked about the probability of Deere being correct and of Michael Morse actually being the person responsible, Lowe noted that he didn't believe that to be the case, but in reality, he couldn't know anything with a degree of certainty, saying, quote, "What he's got is a theory, and there are thousands of theories when it comes to this case. Hell, I've got a theory. Can I say no, Michael Morse did not do it? No, I'd be a fool if I said that. But do I doubt it? Yeah, I do. But I can't say for sure. Nobody can." End quote. Gresham Shinn said that the family was frustrated by the lack of progress, referring to this time as the torment of not knowing. 1 month later, in February of 1980, local television station KATV Channel 7 presented a new series that would examine unsolved cases in the area. The show, debuting Monday, February 18th, was entitled Unsolved Mysteries, Leads, Legwork, and Legends. The show ran episodes Monday through Thursday and utilized actors and actual investigators to recreate the events of crimes. It was announced that Bobo's disappearance would be one of those stories covered, and executive producer Jim Pitcock visited Magnolia to interview investigators, witnesses, and friends. They also filmed at important locations from the case. Though unrelated to the case, it's worth noting that this Unsolved Mysteries show premiered 7 years prior to the one we're all familiar with. Despite exhaustive searching, I could not find a copy of Bobo's episode, but if you are in possession of it, please reach out because I would love to see it. I did manage to find some amazing archival footage of Bobo's studio, interviews with police, and images of the many, many composite sketches that were created, which I'll be sharing on YouTube and social media later in the week, but I digress. For the most part, the case sort of stalls out at this point in the early 1980s. While it remains active and Mike Lowe continues to investigate, very little is said publicly. There are searches carried out, but for the most part, investigators attempt to keep the precise locations hidden from the public as they don't want to tip off a suspect or encourage locals to go searching in those areas by themselves. A large part of this time period is dedicated to chasing down the possibility that Bobo's disappearance is connected to other crimes in other states. Unable to track down someone local who may have been involved, investigators were involved in the questioning of a wide number of different suspects. Some you've heard of, others who never really broke into the headlines. Among the names considered at different times are Robert Zanni, a violent criminal who targeted real estate agents throughout the late 70s in Texas and Oklahoma. The disappearance of several Louisiana women, including one taken from an Albertsons grocery store in broad daylight, led to discussions between Louisiana and Arkansas authorities about a probable link. The suspect in those cases fit closely to Bobo's, a bearded white male believed to be in his late 20s. The disappearance of Aria Vall out of Bossier Parish and the murder of Dodie Gay, a high school student, were connected to the area of that Albertsons, but neither case was ever solved. Shreveport Detective Lieutenant Donnie Nichols dismissed the possibility of any connection between their cases and Bobo's, noting that it appeared their suspect was specifically targeting an area and his victims didn't fit with any pattern related to the missing 25-year-old. Then, there was the stabbing murder of real estate agent Gene McFall, which eventually was connected to James DeBartolabin, one of the most notorious serial killers and one of the United States' preeminent counterfeiters. Perhaps the most famous or infamous name to be considered in this investigation was Henry Lee Lucas. Investigators spent time questioning him and his frequent partner, Otis Toole. Lucas was quickly ruled out, however, when it was determined that he was in police custody at the time of the disappearance. That, combined with the fact that the so-called confession killer denied ever entering southern Arkansas, made it mostly a wrap. There are, of course, always side stories to tell when it comes to alternate suspects or well-known killers being considered, and later this week I'll be releasing some bonus materials on Patreon digging a little deeper into these men and their once considered associated crimes. In January of 1981, a 13th Judicial Circuit Court ruled against the family of Michael Morse in their lawsuit against William Dear. Both Dear and Tatum had been listed as defendants, but Tatum was released from the complaint by the plaintiff. By the time of the judgment, only Morse's widow Norma was still involved, as his mother, Corinne, tragically passed away in a car accident just a few months after the complaint was filed. 3 years later, in October of 1984, Gresham and Sue Shinn sat for an interview with the Shreveport Journal, where they expressed their grief and frustration with the lack of developments, though they also noted that they were as dedicated as ever to finding their daughter and the person responsible for her disappearance. Even if it meant draining their bank accounts, selling off their properties, and going homeless, they were willing to do whatever it took. Sue struggled to understand why her daughter would have given a ride to the unknown caller unless perhaps she knew him. She explained, quote, "I just can't understand it. She just wasn't the type to pick up a stranger like that. She was always the most careful. Of the 7 or 8 or 9 little girls she grew up with, she was always the one that would want to walk on the right side of the street. She was always the most careful. I feel like it had to be someone she knew." End quote. Gresham agreed that the common belief among the family and with investigators was that this was not a crime perpetrated by a drifter or some passerby. It wasn't a stranger who had simply wandered into town and randomly selected the name Bobo Shinn. For the first time, Gresham revealed that there may have been evidence suggesting that in the weeks leading up to the crime, that his daughter was being stalked. On Thursday, July 6th, 2 weeks before the disappearance, one of the family's dogs got sick and died. 1 week later, on Thursday, July 13th, a week before the disappearance, the other dog got sick and died. Gresham explained, quote, "I wish we had done an autopsy on those dogs. Nothing was wrong with either of them. Then the smaller one, a Cocker Spaniel, the weaker one, got sick and died. Exactly a week later, the German Shepherd died." End quote. These new details certainly seem to suggest the possibility that someone may have been keeping an eye on Bobo and or the family home. If the dogs' deaths were likely the result of foul play, as is suggested, then it's difficult to ignore the likelihood that someone was on the family property on those days. At the same time, without autopsies and without knowing for sure, it's difficult to follow up on. Yes, someone could have poisoned the dogs, but at the same time, the dogs could have gotten into something toxic all on their own. 2 years later, in September of 1986, Sue Shinn participated in another interview, this time with the Batesville Guard. She expressed frustration that investigators had, in the past, led them to believe that they were just about to break the case open, only for nothing to happen. She stated, quote, "Many times they led us to believe that they were right on the verge of something, and we'd be on edge, and they'd just go off on other things. It just hurts us so bad. It was like that all the way through." End quote. She noted that they had hired several private investigators only for nothing to be solved. Some, Sue said, preyed on their emotions and peeled large sums of money out of their pockets with a lot of promises that were never fulfilled. Several times they were told that their daughter had been found, only for it to turn out to be a case of mistaken identity or some low-level scam to try and get some more reward money. According to Sue, one private investigator had them so convinced that he'd located Bobo that they sent their son Jay to pick her up, only for it to turn out to be a completely different woman. Asked about William Dear's investigation, Sue replied that he once mentioned to them that he would get $1 million worth of advertising if he could solve the case. She went on, quote, "That didn't make us feel very good, that he was doing it for his own glory. But of course, we wanted him to do it, and we were willing to pay, but it went on and on until we just couldn't." End quote. William Dear was the last investigator the family hired, with Sue noting they fired him after all of the publicity surrounding his actions failed to yield any new, solid, or pursuable information. To some degree, they believed that Dear did the best he could, and the family still harbored some belief that the rift between Deere and Mike Kennard likely undermined some of the investigation. Sue agreed that it became a political debate and it was more about fame and money than finding answers. She explained, quote, "They just couldn't work together, even from the very first. They just were so afraid that somebody else was going to get the credit, they wouldn't tell each other things. That's the way we saw it. We couldn't get any satisfaction from anybody because they were all working against each other." End quote. Finally, it had all become too much for them. In a family meeting, Sue and Gresham called in their children and expressed that they had done everything they possibly could, and it was time to leave the mystery in God's hands. They had no intentions of forgetting or dismissing Bobo, nor would they ignore breaks in the case or new developments, but it was slowly killing them, spending every waking moment wondering if today would be the day. Sue acknowledged that for years after the disappearance, she refused to leave the family home in case somebody called. The only way she'd go out anywhere was if they had someone else to sit by the phone for her. The case had worn on both of them physically, affecting their mental and physical health. Both suffered from issues with their hearts, and the tremendous grief and pain did little to assuage it. Sue explained it wasn't a choice, but more a necessity, saying, quote, "It's not that we've given up, and not that we wouldn't do anything we could do. Any of us would. But we just couldn't keep on." End quote. Sadly, just 3 months after this interview, on Tuesday, December 16th, Gresham James Shinn passed away at the age of 70. He had hoped to know the truth of Bobo's fate before his time was up, but his family believes that after shuffling off this mortal coil and into God's grace, he's been reunited with his beloved daughter. Gresham Shinn was laid to rest in Magnolia's Memorial Park Cemetery following a service held at Central Baptist Church. July 20th, 1992 marked 14 years since Bobo was last seen. For nearly a decade, there had been little if anything stated by police about the continued investigation. On that harrowing anniversary, lead investigator Mike Lowe, who took over the case 12 years earlier, participated in a thorough and deeply probing interview. Lowe stated that the investigation had taken them all around the country, pursuing leads in states as far away as Florida, California, and New York. Though it was believed that Bobo had likely been killed, it was still being investigated as a kidnapping because they hadn't found a body. The case was still active, Lowe said, but they hadn't found much, saying, quote, "There's not a month that goes by where we don't check on something involved in the case, and we are still looking into new leads that come up, but so far, we have come across nothing concrete." End quote. The family continued to be haunted by the unknown, though each person took their own measures to protect their heart and sanity. While Sue Shinn acknowledged the likelihood Bobo was deceased, she wasn't ready to commit herself to that, believing there was still some semblance of a chance. For Bobo's older sister Linda, however, all those years of unknowing were too difficult to navigate. She stated, quote, "In my mind, I have decided that she is dead. It's just been hard on the whole family because everything has led to a dead end and nothing we have found out so far has led to anything. It's a total mystery." End quote. For the first time during this interview, Lowe revealed one of the more prominent theories developed among investigators. While there had been a lot of talk about this being an outsider, not someone who walked the streets of Magnolia or grew up alongside Bobo, Lowe did not necessarily agree. 14 years of investigating later, and for the most part, detectives agreed that Bobo was probably targeted from someone in the area. Lowe believed there was a chance this was a case of kidnapping gone wrong. The Shinn family was well known, they had money, and it was entirely possible someone saw an opportunity and planned to abduct Bobo and demand ransom from the family. For one reason or another, something went wrong, and what began as a kidnapping transformed into a murder. Lowe noted that Magnolia is a small town with approximately 12,000 residents, and while not everyone knew one another, the Easy Mart, where Bobo picked up the caller, was the one spot in town where almost everyone local would stop in at least on a weekly basis. At the same time, the witnesses there who had gotten the most detailed look at the unknown man admitted to investigators that they didn't recognize him, nor did they believe they had ever seen him before. Unfortunately, while interesting, it does little to lend credence one way or the other when it comes to a local or a stranger. Lowe couldn't be sure, saying, quote, "I think, and sure as I say this, it'll turn out that some serial killer in Oregon did it. I think that the key is right here. I'd bet on it. I think it was somebody who knew the lay of the land, who knew how far it was from the Easy Mart to the house to her art studio, someone who knew how long it would take for her to get there." End quote. Lowe also wondered about the infamous last statement of Bobo Shinn, "Come looking for me if I'm not back this afternoon." Was that just a joke Bobo made, or did it suggest that perhaps she didn't feel completely safe or comfortable with the caller? Did that statement imply it was someone she knew or knew of, perhaps someone who was a little off, someone who wasn't exactly balanced? Lowe wondered aloud if perhaps it was someone she went to school with or knew through friends, someone quiet, sad, maybe someone she had been kind to, or contrarily, someone who expressed an interest in her that she may have ignored. Maybe it was someone who freaked her out a little bit, sent a shiver down her spine, or maybe that last sentence was just a joke that ironically turned out to be legitimate. The biggest stumbling block for Lowe was the fact that Bobo gave this person a ride. Her family is convinced she would not give a stranger a ride, and it seems unlikely she'd be willing to take the 10-mile trip out along the Taylor Highway with a total stranger, especially one that gave her weird vibes, but one can never know. Bobo was known to be an extremely kind and giving person, the kind of person that someone with ill intentions might be skilled at manipulating or luring into a trap. Lowe also noted that years later, they still weren't really certain about the composite that had been the most publicized, the one based on the carpenter's eyewitness account. Was it accurate? Was he mistaken? Did he see exactly what he explained, or was he possibly mixing up different visits to the home on different days with different people? Former lead investigator Russell Welsh noted that it isn't like the movies or TV and how they show things. Composite drawings aren't meant to be the be-all, end-all when it comes to finding your perp. He explained, quote, "Composite drawings aren't meant to identify anyone. They're only supposed to eliminate suspects. But from the time that drawing hit the newspapers, we were deluged with calls. Everybody had seen this guy. In the car next to them, at the stoplight, at the grocery store. He was all over the place. He was everywhere." End quote. For Welch, he felt they had done everything they possibly could, and from his first 10 months on the case to Lowe taking over for the later 12 years, they worked every angle, every possibility, but they could never get enough to move forward, file a charge, or even directly name a probable suspect. "That's just how investigations go sometimes," he commented, saying, quote, "There are basically just two ways to investigate, although everybody has his own style. You can sit up at night and think about it, try to put yourself in the place of whoever did this and come up with theories, or you can follow the facts and the evidence and go where they lead you. Sometimes you don't have enough facts, enough evidence to reach a conclusion. That doesn't mean it was a bad investigation." End quote. For their part, at least, the Shinn family has stood up for Mike Lowe, expressing their belief that he did everything he possibly could and continues to. Speaking to the Magnolia Banner News in April of 2011, 33 years after the disappearance, Bobo's brother Jay stated, quote, "We are particularly grateful to Mike Lowe for continuing to work on this case for so many years. We are deeply appreciative of his efforts to bring a resolution to it and to check out any information." End quote. 2 months later, on Friday, June 12th, Mike Lowe, 3 Columbia County Sheriff's Office investigators, and 2 trustees, along with employees of a private drilling company, spent much of their morning excavating an old water well in the area near to Lake Columbia, northwest of Magnolia. Lowe requested that the media not reveal the exact location, but specified that the drill site was within, quote, an area of interest to investigators. The site was within close proximity to the former dirt and gravel road where Harry Irwin saw what he believed to be Bobo's blue car veering back and forth the afternoon she vanished. The area has changed a lot over the years, but the location searched is described as approximately 3 miles, as the crow flies, from where Irwin spotted the car. That road is now a part of AR 344, which travels close to Lake Columbia's eastern shore. Lowe noted that the well they were drilling and the nearby abandoned home are surrounded by a type of grass similar to that found on the floorboards of Bobo's car the night she vanished. Bones were recovered at the site, but following an analysis it was determined that they were not human. They hadn't expected to find much, but it was a location Lowe walked all the way back in the late 70s, and to this day remains a place that they believe could be connected to the case. Their failure to find anything does add up over time, and Lowe often feels frustrated thinking that maybe they'll never find an answer. He explained, quote, "What I fear is the only way we're going to find her is if somebody walks us to it and says, right here, and that somebody may be dead by now, but we're going to keep on trying." End quote. Lowe left his position with the state police, but continued to work the case. He eventually ran for and was elected as Columbia County Sheriff. One of his first actions was to take all of the available evidence in the case and ship it out to the state crime lab and the FBI for a thorough analysis in the hopes that maybe they might be able to lift the suspect's DNA. Whether or not a full or partial profile was developed has never been revealed. Lowe also reached out to the FBI for assistance specifically from the Forensic Sciences Unit, but given the limited information in the case, they were not able to develop a profile of a potential suspect. On Saturday, October 6, 2012, Sue Shinn passed away at the age of 93. Her obituary notes that she was preceded in death by her husband Gresham, but there is no mention of Bobo. Even to her last days, 34 years after her daughter's disappearance, she refused to believe that she was truly gone, holding out hope beyond hope that somehow, one way or another, she would learn the truth. Tragically, the answers are yet to be found, and Sue was laid to rest beside Gresham in Magnolia's Memorial Park Cemetery. 2 years later, on Saturday, July 19, 2014, one day before the 36th anniversary of Bobo's disappearance, her siblings and living family members made the decision to finally hold a memorial service for her. They had not done so throughout their parents' lives because neither could accept that she was truly gone, and it felt like giving up to them to hold a service. This service was held at Central Baptist Church, and countless friends, family members, and schoolmates got up to speak about Bobo, celebrating the joy they shared with her and mourning the loss of a truly gifted, kind, and caring young woman. Southern Arkansas University established a Master of Arts in Teaching scholarship in Bobo's name, and they continue to award it each year. They accept donations towards the scholarship both on their website and via mail, and I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes. A tombstone was erected in the cemetery near to Bobo's parents, which simply reads, "Mary Jimmie Bobo Shinn, forever loved by family, forever cherished by friends." Present at that memorial was Mike Lowe, who was still working the case in whatever capacity he could. Even after retiring as sheriff, he was allowed to work the case by the new sheriff, and when necessary, he's given access to deputies to conduct police actions and searches. The next year, in January of 2015, Lowe decided to restart the investigation from the beginning. He relied only on what solid evidence they had obtained, dismissing other less reliable clues, such as the carpenter's eyewitness account. He began re-interviewing witnesses, getting their statements down on video, and he sent out more information to FBI profilers in hopes of developing some lead, no matter how minor. To this day, Lowe still works the case, marking 45 years that he has been involved in this investigation. In a 2023 interview, Lowe stated that he continues to receive information and pursues all leads. In what can only be described as a shocking revelation, Lowe told the Banner News that he has managed to narrow his list of suspects down to just one, and that person is still alive and living in Columbia County. Asked about the case all those years later, Lowe replied, quote, "Usually, you'll have an ex-wife, or a girlfriend, or a kid, or a friend who'll come in and say, they heard so-and-so say something about a crime. You'll have somebody in jail, and their cellmate will confess something to them, and they'll trade that information for stuff like cigarettes or radios. More crimes get solved through jailhouse confessions than any other way. That's almost always how it works. Somebody talks. And if two people know, we're fixing to solve the thing because sooner or later, one of them will confide in somebody or drink too much and let something slip or cut a deal to save themselves. We haven't had any of that. Nobody has talked. Whoever did this, he didn't tell a soul. And he was incredibly lucky because apparently nobody really saw him and law enforcement didn't have a lot to go on. You know that old saying about looking for a needle in a haystack? We're still looking for the haystack. If we can find the haystack, then we can start looking for the needle. I've got 2 other cases that are still unsolved, but this one, well, I've retired from the state police and I can't be sheriff forever. And this is the one I want to put a cap on before I go home for the last time. I will never give up. Long as I'm living, I'll keep looking for her." End quote. When last seen, Mary Jimmie Bobo Shinn was described as being a white female with brown hair and eyes, standing 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing approximately 118 pounds. Bobo has a scar on her left cheek and a birthmark on her forehead. She was last seen driving her custom blue 1976 Buick Special in the area of Magnolia, Arkansas on Thursday, July 20th, 1978. There is no description or accounting for what clothing Bobo was wearing that day. However, it has been confirmed that she wore a custom-designed gold necklace with 3 diamond pendants. It has never been recovered. Bobo is believed to have picked up an unknown man at the Easy Mart in downtown Magnolia that morning, possibly stopped at the house she had for sale at 718 East McNeil Street, and may have been spotted driving in the Taylor Highway area west of town. At the time of her disappearance, Bobo was 25 years old, and if alive today, she would now be 72. Asked about his older sister, decades later, Jay Shinn still felt the sparkle of a smile memories of his sister brought not just to him, but everyone who had the pleasure to have known her and the honor to have loved and been loved by her. Jay stated, quote, "Her legacy is the memories of her art, and the effect she had on her students she taught in Magnolia. I know it sounds kind of trite, but I would like people to just remember she was a good person. The hard part is just imagining where she would be in her life 30 years later. When I think about what I've done in 30 years, it just seems real unfair that her life was cut short. I think about the person she would be now. I encourage anyone who knew anything about it, if they do, to talk to Mike Lowe at this time. If there was something that they knew back then that they didn't bring forward, if they would now for our family's peace of mind. There is really no closure to it until you know what happened. I think our family handled it through faith that she was going to be okay wherever she was. And that's really the only way to look at it, whether she's alive or whether she's in heaven, that she has peace. We feel like we might eventually find out what happened. We're also kind of resigned to the fact that this is kind of the way life is. We don't know if we will ever have an answer. The disappearance of Bobo Shinn is a complex case made more difficult to find your way through by the lack of evidence, or at least the lack of helpful evidence. Between the car, eyewitnesses, and a pretty tight timeline, law enforcement has since the early days had a fairly good idea of how and what happened that day. They can account for Bobo's location from the moment she woke up until she picks up the unknown caller at the Easy Mart, and from there it becomes more questionable. Unfortunately, you're stuck relying on different eyewitness accounts, and there's really no way to know who is or is not reliable, who's remembering accurately, who's unknowingly filling in gaps and misremembering, and who possibly could be consciously lying about what they did or did not see. We know for certain that Bobo was home and took a walk with her mother around 6:30 a.m., and that the next event on her daily schedule was teaching a children's art class at her studio on Magnolia Street at 10 a.m. For the most part, there's no information about what Bobo may or may not have been up to from the time her mother left until she arrives at the art studio sometime just prior to 10 a.m., but there does not appear to be anything majorly significant in the gap of lost time, at least nothing that would likely alter the events to come. Around 11 a.m., Bobo's friend Angie Pendrick calls to chat and confirms plans for that day where they're supposed to get together, play tennis, and maybe have lunch. According to Pendrick, the two were supposed to get together around 1:30, but by that time, even though no one knew it, Bobo was already missing. According to Pendrick, Bobo told her that she was waiting for a phone call from someone who had an interest in the house on McNeil. This caller is allegedly the same person she met with the previous day when she gave him a tour of the remodeled house, and from what we can tell, that meeting went off without a hitch. At the same time, an unknown man is placing a call from a payphone outside of the Easy Mart. Bobo receives a call at her studio 0.6 of a mile to the north. The route from the studio to the Mart is fairly direct. Head east on Magnolia, turn right onto North Dundee, and the Mart will be on the left as you approach the intersection of Dundee and East Main Street. According to Google Maps, that's a 3-minute drive or a 12-minute walk. Now, the phone call itself is one of the first instances in this case where I find myself a little confused about the way it's reported. It's always told like this guy called Bobo, told her he wanted to trade property out along the Taylor Highway for the house on McNeil. He says that his car is being worked on at Jordan Pontiac Buick directly south across the street from the Easy Mart. He apparently says that because of this, he'll need to take a taxi and he can meet Bobo at her art studio. Apparently, she tells the caller not to worry about the cab, she'll come pick him up at the Easy Mart. I can't help but wonder why she makes this choice. At the studio, she's less than half a mile from the remodeled house, or what Google Maps lists as a 2-minute drive. Why not tell him to take the taxi there and meet him at the house? Or why not allow him to take a taxi to the studio from where you can make the quick 2-block drive? Surely Bobo, who had a reputation for being exceedingly kind, may have wanted to save the guy time or money, or because it's a possible business transaction, she wants to be accommodating. But the walk from the Easy Mart to the house on McNeil is literally 11 minutes. She spends more time between telling the man she'll pick him up and actually arriving at the Easy Mart than it would have taken for him to walk the distance himself. According to the timeline, she leaves the art studio sometime between 11:15 and 11:20. She is thought at this point to have driven home and changed her clothes, although there's some debate about that. Her mother saw her in a t-shirt and cut-off jean shorts and believes she wouldn't have met her client dressed like that, but we have no idea of knowing if, after her mother left that day, she took a shower, changed clothes, and then went to the studio. However, given the fact that if she left the studio at 11:20, she should have picked up the man at the Easy Mart around 11:22 or 23, but that sighting doesn't happen until 11:30 or 40. The total round-trip distance traveled from the studio to the family home on Sioux Street to the Easy Mart and then back up to the McNeil Street home is approximately 4.5 miles, or what Google lists as a 13-minute drive without traffic. This doesn't account for the time that Bobo might have spent in her home changing her clothes. For the sake of argument, let's say she's home for 2 minutes. That means she leaves her studio at 11:20. She's arriving at the Easy Mart at approximately 11:33, which falls correctly into the timeline, or at least close enough. Then, it's 2 more minutes north and then east to the house on McNeil, which should have Bobo and the caller arriving between 11:35 and 11:40 at the latest. Many of these times are later confirmed by eyewitnesses, from the witnesses at the Easy Mart who see the caller to the man who spots her at the mart with the unknown caller getting into her car. From here, however, things somewhat diverge. We have a witness from Jordan Pontiac who claims he sees Bobo at the Easy Mart at 11:40. According to him, when she pulls out from the store, she doesn't head north towards McNeil. Instead, she turns left and then right onto East Main Street. She stops at a traffic light and is last seen by this witness stopped at the intersection of Main and Pine Streets, which is 1 block west of the Easy Mart. Now, if the two were heading to McNeil, they would have just headed north, as McNeil connects to North Dudney. But if they went west, this implies there was another stop along the way, or when Bobo picked the man up, she was already heading out of town to view his alleged property along the Taylor Highway. That makes a lot of sense to me. Sure, the caller may have wanted to see the McNeil home again, but he literally toured it the day before and is already offering to trade land and some cash for it. Now, it's only my opinion, but I'm not sure I believe that Bobo and the unknown man ever went to the McNeil Street house on the 20th. At 12 p.m., another witness tells the police that he spotted Bobo's car at a gas station along Main Street where he saw an unidentified male entering the vehicle with her before she drove off. The final alleged sighting comes from Harry Irwin at 12:05 when he spots what he believes to be Bobo's car moving along a dirt and gravel road west of town in the area of what is today AR 344. This location is approximately 3.5 miles from where Bobo is last seen and has a total driving time of 5 minutes. This suggests that if Bobo truly was last seen around 12 p.m. on Main Street, then Irwin's sighting 5 minutes later actually lines up. These accounts do not leave any available time for Bobo and the unknown man to have traveled 2 minutes from the Easy Mart to the McNeil Street home, where the carpenter claims they spend 10 to 15 minutes inside before leaving. This is hardly the only discrepancy in his account, but we'll get more into some of those issues with his sighting later. However, if you do include that account, then Bobo and the man arrive at the McNeil home sometime between 11:30 and 11:40, to be generous, even though we have a conflicting witness who places Bobo at the Easy Mart at 11:40. They spend 10 to 15 minutes at the house, so now we're between 11:40 and 11:55. The drive from that home to the Irwin sighting is approximately 8 minutes. This would have her arriving there between 11:48 and 12:03, which are both too early for Irwin, though I would guess the latter time could fit depending on if Irwin assumed it to be 12:05 or if he actually looked at his watch. While that would fit, it somewhat calls into question the eyewitness who sees Bobo at the gas station at 12 o'clock, since this timeline would not allow for an additional stop lasting more than a minute. Now, the carpenter, his account just throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing. Initially, he tells investigators that he sees Bobo arrive at the house at about 11 a.m. We know this can't be correct because at that time she's still at the studio. He then amends his account to say that it could be any time between 10:30 and 11:30. So you've gone from, I know it was 11 o'clock to, well, it could be anywhere in this hour of time. And based on other information, we know that the earliest she could have arrived there, even if she skipped going home, and it contradicts with other eyewitness testimony, is about 11:25. We know she's called at 11:15. We know she calls her friend back around 11:20. The entire trip from the studio to the mart to the house for sale is 1.1 miles, and not accounting for traffic or stoplights, this is a trip which by car takes 5 minutes. So it's more accurate to say if she did go to the house that day, she likely arrived between 11:25 and 11:35. Tack on 10 to 15 minutes for being inside of the house, and now you're looking at 11:35 to 11:50 as your range, which we know doesn't really fit with any of the other times. However, the time of day is probably the least of this witness's discrepancies. We know from Bobo telling Angie and from her sister overhearing the call that she has to go pick this guy up at the Easy Mart. Yet, according to the carpenter, she arrives traveling from the east. An unknown man arrives traveling from the west. The carpenter knows the other car is dark green with a lighter green vinyl top, But he's kind of stuck on what kind of car it is, saying it could be a Pontiac anywhere between 1969 and 1979, or maybe a 1972 Bonneville Catalina, or perhaps a Le Mans. Now, in fairness to this guy, the body types of these vehicles are somewhat similar, although their headlights and brake lights are vastly different. But who knows? Maybe he's just not a car guy. The problem is, everything we know says Bobo picked this guy up, so there should not be anyone arriving in a second car at all. Since there is no record of another call, it's not likely that Bobo called this guy back or that he called her again and then they changed plans to meet at the house together. That would have made the whole talk about a taxi completely unnecessary. According to the carpenter, after being in the house for between 10 and 15 minutes, the two walk outside, get into their separate vehicles, and then drive off in the same direction, heading west down McNeil towards North Dudney. He's able to give a description. White male, 25 to 28, 6'1 to 6'2, around 215 pounds. He says the man is thick-built and broad across the shoulders. He also says the man has collar-length brown hair, a medium-length beard, and wore a mesh baseball-style hat. Now, 75 feet isn't that far away, and even with my increasingly poor eyesight, I could give a pretty accurate description from that distance. I sincerely doubt, however, that I could pick a face out of a lineup at that distance, but there'd be enough general impression for me to describe. We don't know enough about the carpenter to know for sure how good or poor his eyesight was. What I've read says he wore very thick Coke bottle-like glasses, but that doesn't tell us much as both near and far-sighted lenses can get quite thick. I assume if the man had removed his glasses to look across the street, that would have been noted. So we've got several issues. The timeline and the second car to be sure. Then, according to police, there's a man who lives just a few houses down from the one Bobo was selling. He drives a green car with a light green top. He has longer dark hair, a beard, and wears a mesh baseball-style hat. They theorized that the carpenter saw that man driving down the road and mixed it up with the man Bobo supposedly picked up. I think there are many questions here that, without the answer, it's hard to judge for sure. Was the carpenter working on the roof with a full view across the street, or was he doing the floor in the living room and occasionally glancing out the window? How long exactly did he see Bobo and the unknown man, and from what angle? Were they facing him, or did they have their backs to him most of the time? I don't mean to demean the witness or call his credibility into question, but eyewitnesses are notoriously inaccurate, and it's not like there was some inciting incident, an accident or something to really grab his attention. He sees people at the house across the street that's for sale, but for 30 seconds or 5 minutes straight, it's hard to say. To me, there's a few possibilities here. Either the carpenter has mixed up the suspect with the neighbor, or he has mixed up his dates and times. You're doing work on a house. 2 or 3 days later, I come and ask you if you saw anything across the street, specifically on Thursday. Are you going to remember with 100% certainty the difference between a man and a woman at that house on Wednesday and a man and a woman at that house on Thursday? Maybe, maybe not. But given the time issue, the second car, and him being the only witness who describes this guy as bigger in both height and body shape, I'm not sure how you can rely on it. I think when Mike Lowe restarted the investigation in 2015, it was probably the right move to throw the carpenter's statement out the window. You don't gain much from it besides a possible description of the suspect, but it also contradicts all the other witnesses who saw this guy. They generally make him several inches shorter, thick across the middle, but not broad-shouldered or muscular. They also give him dark curly hair and a clean-shaven appearance. You're probably not tracking a suspect down based purely on a description or a composite drawing regardless, so there isn't a great deal of value lost here. We know for a fact that Bobo showed the unknown caller the house the day prior, Wednesday the 19th, at approximately 4 p.m. There is no mention there of the man needing a ride, so could the carpenter have seen him pull up in a green car that day and blended the two accounts together? I don't think that's necessarily outside of the realm of possibility. To simplify everything, we focus on things that we know with a level of certainty. We know Bobo's called at 11:15 and agrees to pick the man up to Easy Mart. We know based on what she tells her friend that she's going to take the man out along the Taylor Highway, approximately 9 miles outside of town, where he reportedly owns some land he might be willing to trade. If this guy has already decided, hey, I've got some land to trade if you're interested, I just don't imagine he needs to go back and see the McNeil Street house again. He literally saw it less than 24 hours earlier. Not to mention, if we're going on the assumption that this caller is the guy responsible for Bobo's disappearance, there's no reason to go back to that house unless that's where you plan to spring into action. Makes a lot more sense to target a rural, quiet area outside of town instead of along a neighborhood road in broad daylight. The last alleged sighting of Bobo happens when Harry Irwin sees the blue car, believed to be hers, swerving along the dirt and gravel road in the area of what is today AR 344. Irwin reports to police 2 days later that he saw the car traveling away from Magnolia and that it looked like a man and woman were fighting for control of the wheel. We then have 3 witnesses who place Bobo's Buick Special being seen in the parking lot at Smitty's, where it's later found by police, sometime between 1 and 1:30, although 2 of the 3 witnesses say 1 p.m. According to their calculations, giving everything involved, approximately 57 minutes passed between Bobo driving out of town and her car being spotted at the grocery mart. Accounting for time of travel, this suggests that whatever happened and wherever Bobo was taken is likely no more than 23 to 25 miles out of town, as that trip, round trip, would take 57 minutes, which would leave the suspect exactly 0 time to actually do anything besides drive there and then turn around and come back. If what happened to Bobo took anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes on the low end, then you're actually looking at a travel time outside of Magnolia of no more than 18 to 23 minutes, which reduces the distance to between 15 and 18 miles. This would suggest to me that whoever the suspect was, he had some knowledge of the area and had pre-picked the location he planned to take Bobo to, either because he was connected to it in some way or because he knew it was out of the way enough that no one was going to come along and interrupt him. Now, that encompasses a lot of areas. If we focus primarily to the west, given that's where the car is believed to have been seen, there's a lot of different possibilities. An 18-mile radius would include cities like Stamps, Buckner, Jefferson, Waldo, and even Taylor. Lake Columbia would also be within this radius. Suffice it to say, there's very little to go on when it comes to trying to determine where Bobo might have been taken. Most searches have focused in the area between U.S. routes 371 and 82 and AR 344. Most of that land, even to this day, is farmland. And I imagine back in 1978, it was even more so. While it's helpful to have grass clippings and seeds to help in determining the search area, when you're surrounded by farms and hay fields and grassy wooded areas, it doesn't do that much for you. I imagine law enforcement focused in on private property owners in that area and any locations that might be unofficial. Places teens hung out or remote plots of land that were overgrown and not maintained or observed by anybody, generally speaking. Turning your attention to the car, while we have extensive details about its condition and the items found within, none of that really helps in figuring out this mystery. The purse is dumped out, but allegedly this was done by one of the first officers on the scene, so we can't really say the suspect was specifically digging through her belongings looking for anything or that there was any kind of a struggle in the car. The shoes are fascinating. Bobo's white size 8 tennis shoes are found on the driver's side floorboard and partially tucked under the brake and accelerator. According to Mike Lowe, he believes that the killer drove the car back to Smitty's with those shoes lying in that position. Why you wouldn't toss them out the window or leave them at the crime scene, I honestly don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The car is in a condition that suggests it was driven off-road and through a wooded area, what with scratches along the exterior and deep ones along the rear driver's side fender. Being that the car was left with the doors unlocked, windows rolled down, and keys dangling from the ignition, suggests whoever left the car there didn't mind how quickly it was found, nor did he care if someone came along and stole it. The latter would probably have helped his cause. But there's no solid evidence in there. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to tell us what happened. Forensic sweeps do pull up fingerprints, which they've never identified, but even Bobo can't be ruled out. Reportedly, 3 hairs were recovered, but they have thus far been unable to develop a full DNA profile. We unfortunately know nothing about the hairs. Are they long or short, blonde, brown, red, male, female? Those answers would probably help a little bit, but like so much of this case, it's just another mystery. Moving away from evidence, because really, we've pretty much touched on everything that might be considered solid, factual information, we get to different ideas about who might have done this. Not necessarily the exact person, but the type of person. There's generally 2 ideas. This was a crime pulled off by a stranger to the area, either someone staying in town short-term or merely passing through, or this was planned and executed by someone local, perhaps even someone Bobo knew or who knew her. So we'll begin with the outsider analysis. There's not a great deal to analyze as pertains to this being a random crime pulled off by someone who was not native to or familiar with Magnolia and its surrounding landscape. This person could have seen Bobo and decided they wanted to take her, or they could have read through the local paper, spotted the ad about the house for sale, and then began feeling things out. They call a few days before the crime, talking about wanting to know where Bobo hangs out. They make plans to view the house, which they do on the 19th, and then they tell Bobo, "I'll call you tomorrow with a possible offer." Then, on the 20th, they pull the no-car scam and abduct her while she's driving them out of town. Certainly a possibility that can't be ruled out. Things like that happen all the time. Now, Bobo was a lifelong resident of Magnolia, and belonging to a well-known family, she knew a lot of people. It seems somewhat odd to friends and family that she would show this person the house on Wednesday and agree to pick them up on Thursday, but never mention their name to anyone else. If it were someone from out of town, a total stranger, or something along those lines, you'd think she'd mention that he was new in town, or he didn't know the area well, or was planning to move to Magnolia, but she doesn't. It also wouldn't make sense for him to own land along the Taylor Highway. In fact, the only reference we know for sure that she makes is the one about coming to search for her if she doesn't come back. The only reason to say that about a stranger would be because they gave you an odd or uncomfortable vibe, and I find it somewhat difficult to believe she would be willing to pick this person up, all to drive them out of town into the middle of nowhere if she were legitimately unnerved or put off by them. At the same time, we have no way of knowing how trusting or naive Bobo may have been. Her family doesn't believe she would just pick up a stranger, but that's what almost every family says in cases like this, and we know, in some instances, people do things they normally would not do. For me, what gives the feeling that this was not a random passerby or stranger is the specificity of it. This person tells Bobo his car is a Jordan Pontiac Buick while they're talking on the payphone directly across the street from it. He eventually leaves her car at Smitty's, directly west from the street that the Easy Mart is on. If I'm from out of town, why would I contain myself to such a tight space? Why bother bringing the car back into town at all when I could just drive it 200 miles away and dump it in the woods or a river? This suggests that the killer had his own car, which he left somewhere near to the 3 major businesses associated with this case. Obviously, it's not some type of conspicuous car that stands out, nor was it parked in an area where someone might notice or find it strange. Also, if the killer is traveling, he likely has his own car and needs to retrieve it, so Bobo's car has to be brought back regardless. But if you've got the world at your fingertips, why not have her pick you up more towards the outskirts of town, or in an area where you're less likely to be seen by anyone? Why not then leave her car in a more remote location where it's going to take longer to be found or spotted? Well, maybe this guy isn't all that put together, given that he travels to different places and hunts victims. That would make some sense. But then did he pull this crime off flawlessly, or did he, by some form or measure, get really lucky? It's hard to say with any certainty, but given that we have no real names, no real leads, and no real outsider suspects, there's not much further you can go to analyze the motives or methods. Now, I tend to agree with investigators that this feels more like a crime committed by someone who, at a minimum, knew Magnolia and its surrounding areas. This person didn't come up with this idea on a whim. They planned it out, timed it out, mapped it out, and then executed it. Wednesday the 19th was somewhat of a dry run. Meet up with Bobo at the house, do a general tour of it, maybe build a little rapport and disarm the victim by making her feel safe or at least comfortable near you. Then on the 20th, you play the car in the shop card, she agrees to pick you up, and from there, you're pretty much in control. Once she's out of town and away from prying eyes, you can strike and do whatever the plan actually was. At some point, probably on that Wednesday, the suspect gets the phone number to the art studio, probably from Bobo herself. If we take into account that the suspect is also the person who called the family home the Saturday before, we have to assume he either didn't have the number for the studio or he called that day and no one answered. The number left in the paper with the ad is to the Shinn family home, so it makes sense to call there first. Either way, this person has to say something to Bobo to convince her that he's going to call the next day and may have something to trade for the house. Why he doesn't do something that Wednesday when they're alone together is unknown, but maybe he was waiting for really specific circumstances, or he didn't think the home on McNeil offered enough privacy. Maybe he noticed that carpenter across the street. We know, according to her parents, that after the Wednesday showing, she didn't mention anything to them about the buyer, the showing, or anything else. To Sue, this suggested that her daughter didn't think the buyer was serious, or she didn't consider the offer strong enough to even bring to her folks. There's another possibility, though, that maybe this was a person that her parents or siblings might have known. Maybe someone who, if she mentioned the name, they'd say, "Why are you wasting your time with that guy?" Or, "You know we don't like that person," for whatever random reason. Maybe there's some kind of a history there, either directly or he's known around town to be a little off or strange. Bobo was very social. She wasn't super secretive, so there has to be a reason why she wouldn't mention the potential buyer's name, but sadly, we may never know. Now, I am somewhat inclined to believe that whoever is responsible for Bobo's disappearance worked alone. I'm primarily led to believe that because of the fact that Bobo's car was driven back to Magnolia. If more than one person were involved, I'd expect to have that second person waiting at whatever location Bobo was taken to, and then after everything's done, you drive back together. You leave Bobo's car there, or you dump it in the middle of nowhere where it likely won't be found right away, buying yourself more time. That, plus the fact that no witnesses report seeing another person, it's always just felt like Bobo and the unknown man and nobody else. Given the lack of physical evidence, it seems that whoever got into Bobo's car that day did not strike out against her until she was either out of the car or they pulled some kind of a weapon on her and she was forced to get out of the car without fighting. It seems like one of two things probably happened. Either Bobo was taken to the location, removed from the car, and then killed or disposed of in that specific area, or she was taken to some location, locked up or concealed there, and then the suspect drove the car back only to return later in his own car, knowing that the focus of the investigation will now be in town once the car is found. If the latter scenario happens, then Bobo could have been taken anywhere, and there'd be no way of knowing. This would also buy the suspect more time to do whatever it was that he had in his twisted mind. Now, there's been some information presented to raise the possibility that whoever did this might have been stalking Bobo in the weeks leading up to the crime. There are reports of the family dogs dying on the 2 Thursdays leading up to the abduction, which also happens on a Thursday, which I find interesting. However, since the dogs were not autopsied, we don't actually know what killed them. Surely someone could have poisoned them, but they also could have gotten into something toxic all on their own. It's also possible, depending on the dog's behaviors, that someone completely unassociated with the case may have wanted to get rid of them because some people are just messed up like that. The dogs and the Saturday call are the only reasons people have considered stalking, and I think that's a possibility, but I don't think we have enough evidence to confirm it. If you're planning to take her from a trip outside of town, why does it matter if you eliminate the dogs from the house? If you know where she lives and you're following her around, then you also know the art studio's location and you could have gone there anytime you knew she'd be there by herself. If you're already planning to abduct her under the guise of purchasing the remodeled home, why bother calling the house or asking around where she hangs out? I think part of the problem with this case is we don't know with any certainty that the abductor is in fact the man who called the week before. We have to work with a lot of assumptions here. I think it's likely that whoever did this was local. They might not have been from Magnolia, but maybe one of the surrounding communities. I mean, remember, Southern Arkansas University is in Magnolia, and that school would have drawn in students from all over the state and probably some other states. So there's a possibility it's someone who attends the school there, knows the town well enough, but isn't actually a local or someone that might be considered a local. The question becomes, was this a perp with a victim in mind, or was this a suspect with a crime in mind who was actively searching for the victim? There's two different types of predators who will approach things from different angles. Given the calls, given the ad in the paper, it seems likely that Bobo herself was the target, and the crime is much more about her than anything else. Bobo was from an upper-class family whose name carried cachet through Magnolia. She was a very popular and attractive young woman who certainly didn't struggle when it came to having suitors. She's noted as being very kind and welcoming, the kind of person who makes everyone feel like they're important when she's talking with them or spending time with them. A lot of people have wondered if the suspect might be someone that Bobo knew on the periphery. Perhaps someone she had classes with, maybe someone she went to school with but didn't really know, or perhaps someone who worked at or hung around where she used to sunbathe by the pool or where she played tennis. It's entirely possible this could have been someone who had hit on her in the past or tried to get close to her only to be rebuffed and turned down, and things just built from there. It's also entirely possible this was someone who developed an infatuation with Bobo and she had no knowledge of it. It's been reported that the only things missing from Bobo's car when it was found were the air mattress she used when sunbathing and her appointment book. Now, if you're a complete stranger, not someone she knew or recognized, you could have given her any fake name you wanted and neither she nor investigators would have known any better. But if you are someone she knows, or maybe you screwed up and actually gave her your real name or something that could identify you later, you'd need to make sure that appointment book disappeared. That's certainly a possibility. It's also possible that the appointment book was lost, destroyed, or discarded near to where the crime happened, and that it's completely unrelated. We are, in most instances here, devoid of clues. The only real clue we have is that last statement she spoke, the half-joking, half-sarcastic line about coming to look for her if she doesn't come back. To me, that doesn't scream out that she's afraid of this person, but it does sound like something you'd say if you thought the person was a little odd, borderline bizarre, but not sincerely scary. I mean, I don't think anyone would be wise going off on a ride out of town into a rural area alongside someone that you're actually scared of. It just sounds more like what you'd say about someone who other people would view as different or out of the norm, or maybe something you'd say about someone who had expressed an interest in you at some point in time in the past and perhaps took it a little too far. Maybe someone in high school or even earlier who wrote poems or letters, left flowers or candy, even when it had been made clear there was not a mutual attraction. At this point, we can do little more than speculate. When it comes to people in the local area, there's only one who has ever been named, and that wasn't by actual investigators, but out-of-state private investigator William Deere. He focuses in on Michael Glenn Morse, a 27-year-old former ASU student who lives in the city of Stamps, just shy of 20 miles northwest of Magnolia. Now, it is interesting to note that both State Route 82 and AR 344 are roads that you can take from the Magnolia area to Stamps, and those roads border along areas that have been the primary focus of multiple searches. We don't know a whole lot about Morse, at least not that we can verify. We know he lived in Stamps, was married to a woman named Norma, attended SAU for at least 2 years, as he appears in both the 1970 and 71 yearbooks. Bobo graduated from Magnolia High in the spring of 71 and began attending ASU in the fall, so there is the possibility that she and Morse attended campus during the same time and could have run into one another or maybe had a class together. We know for a fact that investigator Mike Lowe also attended SAU and was in at least one class with Bobo. Trying to find information on Morse is difficult at best. There's not much publicly available, at least in terms of family members. They don't appear to have spoken much about him either prior to or even after his death. The only additional information I could find is sadly his obituary, which lists a wife and 3 sons, and a really small blurb in a couple of local area newspapers about a deadly car accident. According to the Northwest Arkansas Times, on Saturday, September 11th, 1971, 36-year-old Shirley Ann Lee was walking along US 82 when a vehicle, driven by then 20-year-old Michael Morse, struck her along the shoulder of the road. She died 2 days later as a result of her injuries. I can find no additional information, how the accident happened, if there were charges, not a thing. Would have been very interesting to find out if this was purely an accident or if there might have been more behind it, but I digress. All I can really say about Morse is that William Deere claimed he was a diagnosed schizophrenic who was under the care of a psychiatrist and was taking antipsychotic medication. How accurate that is, it's difficult to say. It was claimed that Morse was convinced he was Jesus Christ, and that would surely suggest mental health issues, but I don't really have anything solid to corroborate it. In the photos of him I found, I haven't seen him with a beard, but someone who thinks they're Jesus probably will grow one. The most recent photo of him I have is from 7 years before the disappearance. He allegedly wanted to build a church on his family's property, which was supposedly close to what everybody called the hippie hunt, this janky concrete structure in the woods on private property where teenagers and others supposedly hung out to party. Depending on what account you read, it's either still there or it was bulldozed. It's either easy to find or it's really well hidden. It's either haunted or it's not. So the theory coming out was that Morse abducted Bobo, took her to the area of this hippie hut where he killed her and disposed of her somehow that's never been recovered. They even tell stories to this day that the area is haunted by Bobo's ghost, but it sounds like a whole hell of a lot of smoke and not very much fire. According to Deere, he had multiple people telling him that they had heard Morse talking about his involvement in the crime, including a nurse at the psychiatrist's office. The problem is, none of these people ever came forward and put their words down officially on the record. Then, you've got other people unable to determine what he looked like at the time. Some say he had a beard on the 20th, others disagree. 2 secretaries at SAU state to Deere that Morse had a beard when he came to re-enroll in classes on the 26th, 6 days after the crime. Are their words officially in the police report? I couldn't tell you. They're only mentioned in Deere's files. And what about that psychiatrist? He would be legally responsible for reporting anything he is told about a crime that has been committed. That doesn't appear to have happened here. Reportedly, Morse was interviewed in regard to the case because of an anonymous tip stating that he resembled the suspect. The first officer questions Morse and rules him out in his notes, saying that he does not resemble the suspect and he has an alibi. What was that alibi? Nobody knows because the cop didn't write it down and he couldn't remember when he was asked. Then there's the former chief investigator Russell Welsh, who also clears Morse, but like before, he can't remember why, other than remembering the man had an ironclad alibi that we don't know what it was. Welch then notes that he might not have even questioned Morse about the crime, but rather the fact that Morse allegedly called up Gresham Shinn after he was questioned and was extremely angry and volatile on the call, frustrated that he had been questioned in the first place. That certainly doesn't sound like the behavior of someone who's getting along real well. It feels weird, like he's overly angry about being questioned, just as hundreds of other people were questioned. Some would say that implies he's involved. Others would say he just has a short temper and possibly mental health issues. Morse died on Sunday, October 15th, 1978, just shy of 3 months after the disappearance. Morse's death is ruled the result of a self-inflicted gunshot wound fired from a Winchester 90 .22 caliber pump-action rifle. He's reportedly found along Lafayette County Road 34, approximately 2.5 miles north of Stamps. Lafayette 34 runs east to west and stretches out for 1.5 miles. Even today, this road cuts through a rural area of mostly farmland and some wooded areas. Reportedly, there was a debate about the manner of Morse's death, with some thinking it might have been a homicide staged to look otherwise, but whatever investigation was done happened really quickly, because by the listing of his obituary, it basically says it's self-inflicted. For a lot of people, this suggested some kind of guilt or connection to the crime. He's considered a possible suspect, gets spoken to by the police, and within a few months, he's gone. We have no inside knowledge of if a note was left, if anyone foresaw this, if anyone close to him thought that this would have been the outcome with or without the police questioning. Considering all of the talk about him struggling with serious mental health issues, it is unfortunately not a shock to find out the way his life ended. At the same time, people are quick to jump on the fact that he did this 3 months after the disappearance, but nobody ever notes that he died 4 months after his father passed, which could have been another traumatic inciting incident. The question becomes, has he been unfairly vilified in the aftermath as an easy scapegoat for this crime, or is there something more to it? Mike Lowe, Russell Welch, Finis Duval, and Bobo's parents all stated they did not believe Morse was involved. That carries some weight for me, if for no reason other than the fact that there was such a desperate desire to solve this case that I wouldn't have been surprised to see law enforcement connect the dots and just assume this to be the case. Instead, they've kept the case open and active for what is now going on 47 years. I mean, you're talking about a lead investigator who has dedicated 45 years of his life to trying to solve this case. It's hard to imagine he would just dismiss a good suspect out of hand for reasons. To be perfectly frank, I don't know how I feel about Morse. I pretty much feel like without something more, it's difficult to connect him to the disappearance. All of these people had the time and the energy and the effort to reach out to William Deere and tell him all this stuff about Morse being involved, but outside of an anonymous tip claiming that Morse looked like the suspect, no one's ever come forward over all these years to suggest that Morse was involved or mentioned the crime or was behaving oddly around that time. And the guy's gone. It's not like there would be a reason to still be afraid of him. It just doesn't add up. And unfortunately, I find myself incapable of depending too much on the work Deere did because of the family dropping him and all of the back and forth drama in the papers, making it seem like this was a case much more about money and prestige than about actually finding legitimate answers. Everything is circumstantial. He had a beard, he didn't have a beard. He knew Bobo, he didn't know Bobo. There's even mention from a former employer of Morse's that on the day of the disappearance, he took off work because he had to meet his real estate agent in Magnolia. Firstly, Bobo wasn't a real estate agent, but putting that aside, if I'm planning to kill someone under the guise of being shown a house, I'm not going to literally put that in my request off for work. In what I can only call an extremely ironic comment, William Deere referred to Morse as both a genius and a brilliant guy. I'm not sure how many geniuses would plan a murder and then include vital details about their whereabouts on the day of the crime in a time-off request at work. Michael Morse is a very interesting avenue to pursue in this case, but without additional information, I don't know, maybe even a single scrap of evidence, it's really hard to connect him to, well, anything. It feels like people reached out to Deere, made all these claims about a deceased guy, and then no one else ever had anything to say. Doesn't really make sense now, does it? Unfortunately, because he was named, Morse is inexorably linked to this case until and unless a new suspect is identified. The final aspect of this case to discuss for now is potential motive. Some people believe the crime, even if carried out by a local, was more random than not. An easy victim, so to speak. No different from murdering a hitchhiker or a taxi cab driver. It's more about the circumstances and the opportunity than about the crime or the victim. Others think that Bobo herself was directly targeted, whether that was out of rage towards her, a grotesque fascination, or because the killer believed he could manipulate her and lure her into a trap. Then there's the third possibility that perhaps this was never about murder or Bobo herself. Instead, some believe that she may have been targeted with the intent of holding her for ransom, given that the family was well known in the area and had money. Personally, I consider a fourth possibility. The Shinn family were getting good contracts for hotels and motels in the area, and that may have upset others competing for the same jobs. And on top of that, Bobo starts flipping houses, and maybe someone doesn't like her horning in on their business. I've always found it fascinating that the so-called key witness was a carpenter working across the street. I'd love to know if he'd ever spoken to Bobo, if he'd ever offered his services in her house flipping business, or if he had placed a bid on that house or the one she had flipped previously. This was only the second house she'd ever flipped, so it's not like she had a long-established history of doing it. She was new to the game, and someone might have felt possessive about the process or perhaps the houses on McNeil Street themselves. Whether Bobo was taken due to obsession, revenge, or money, those are some of the oldest motives in the book. So what do you believe happened? Was Bobo the target of a random crime? Was it someone local, someone she knew, or a complete stranger who merely saw an opportunity? Was it about Bobo, money, or perhaps some other motive we've yet to come across? This July will mark 47 years since 25-year-old Bobo Shinn mysteriously vanished from Magnolia, Arkansas, and the echoes of that nightmarish day continue to reverberate all of these years later. Surely someone out there has some insight. Surely someone has some information they've never shared or have been too hesitant to bring forward. The only thing we can say with any certainty is that a bright light was snuffed out that summer afternoon, and unless someone comes forward, new evidence is found, or Bobo herself is located, this case will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Mary Jimmie Bobo Shinn, there are many news articles and online posts about her case. For this episode, the most helpful sources were the Batesville Guard, the Magnolia Banner News, and the Arkansas Democrat. If you have any information about the disappearance of Mary Jimmie Bobo Shinn, please contact the Columbia County Sheriff's Office at 870-235-3747. Her case number is C3488678. You can also contact the Arkansas State Police, Company C, at 870-777-8944. It is the same case number as the Sheriff's Office. A reward remains in place for information which leads to Bobo's location or the identification of the suspect. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. You can find all social media and contact links in the show notes. Now I'd like to take a moment to shout out and thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom this podcast would not be possible. Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Christine Greco, Crystal J, Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, Leslie B, Lisa Hobson, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Stacy Finnegan, and Tom Radford. Your continued support and confidence means the world to me, and you are what makes Trace Evidence possible. If you would like to support Trace Evidence on Patreon, you can visit us at patreon.com/traceevidence. Now that we've arrived at the end of the episode, I had no idea it would turn out as long as it did, but there's a great wealth of information out there about Bobo's disappearance, and it's all important to consider. Before wrapping up for the day, just a few quick announcements. Firstly, I wanted to draw your attention to some of the new merchandise we've made available. We have some new designs for shirts and hoodies and everything in between that you can view by visiting shoptepod.com. That's shoptepod.com, or you can visit trace-evidence.com and click the merch link at the top. There are also links in the show notes. I also wanted to announce that I'll be adding a new section to the podcast at the end of episodes, where each week I'll answer a handful of questions from listeners about the previous week's case. You can ask your questions on social media or email them to me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. I thought this would be an interesting way to address some of your thoughts and questions that I get each week, but can't generally getting around to answer all of them. I also wanted to ask a little favor if you've got the time. It really helps the podcast to get reviewed, and I haven't asked for reviews in years, but it would definitely make a difference. Please leave a review for the pod wherever you listen. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods. Obviously, I'd love a 5-star review, but you leave what you think is fair. I really appreciate it. Finally, I just want to thank everyone for their support and kind words. I'm really excited as we move into our 8th year in 2025 to see what we can do, and I've got a lot of great cases in mind to cover. Speaking of, I recently made a guest appearance on one of my favorite podcasts, the Lost and Found podcast. I highly recommend checking it out. I don't listen to a lot of true crime anymore these days, but I never miss Lost and Found. For now, this concludes our coverage of the disappearance of Mary, Jimmie, Bobo, Shinn. A very complicated case with a long history, but it's still solvable. All you need is the right piece of information, and we know someone out there has it. So thank you all again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.